Wild Justice by Andrew Muratti 2023, Chapter 1. The Lone Survivor. Clyde rode into the small saloon town of Dusty Creek, the sun hanging low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town stood as a relic of the Old West, its weathered wooden buildings displaying the scars of time and the harsh elements. The once vibrant facades now faded, their paint chipped and peeled, telling stories of days gone by. The wooden boardwalk creaked under the weight of Clyde's horse as he made his way through the town, the sound echoing through the stillness of the air. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the tang of whiskey, wafting from the saloons that lined the main street. The town seemed quiet, with a few locals milling about, their faces worn and weathered like the buildings. A dog lazily napped in the shade, seeking refuge from the scorching sun. Clyde's keen eyes scanned the buildings, searching for any signs of life that could lead him to the Bones gang, the outlaws responsible for the tragedy that had shattered his family. Dusty Creek held its secrets close, its silent streets hinting at the stories and whispers that lingered in the air. As he dismounted his horse and tied it to a weathered hitching post, an elderly man with a worn-out head approached him. "Evenin', stranger," the man greeted with a raspy voice. "Lookin' for a place to rest your bones?" Clyde nodded, appreciating the gesture. "I could use a room for the night. Any recommendations?" The old man pointed toward a modest boarding house nearby. "Bet there's Mrs. Henderson's place. Ain't fancy, but it's clean and has a comfortable bed. Tell her Jeb sent you, she'll treat you right, thank you," Clyde replied, a hint of gratitude in his voice. He made his way to the building and up the creaking wooden steps, each one echoing with the weight of countless footsteps that had tread upon them. The aging facade of the boarding house revealed a storied history, its weathered walls a testament to the tales it held within. As Clyde entered the boarding house, a sense of nostalgia washed over him. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and the lingering aroma of home-cooked meals. The sound of laughter and animated conversations wafted from the common area, where weary travelers and local townsfolk gathered to share their stories. Mrs. Henderson, the matronly figure who presided over the boarding house, greeted Clyde with a warm smile. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes sparkled with a wisdom earned through years of hosting travelers from far and wide. She had a way of making everyone feel like they belonged. "Evening, stranger," she said, her voice carrying a comforting timbre. "Jeb mentioned you might be stoppin' by. Got a room ready for you, if you're interested." Clyde glanced around the cozy foyer, taking in the warm but lovingly maintained furnishings. The walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper, reminiscent of a bygone era. A crackling fireplace cast a gentle glow, its warmth inviting weary souls to find respite from the harshness of the world outside. He nodded appreciatively and followed Mrs. Henderson down the narrow hallway. The sound of his boots against the polished wooden floor echoed through the corridor, creating a comforting rhythm. As they passed the open doors of occupied rooms, snippets of conversations and hushed whispers reached Clyde's ears, painting a vivid tapestry of the diverse characters seeking refuge under this roof. The room assigned to Clyde was simple but inviting. A comfortable bed with a patchwork quilt took center stage, flanked by a well-worn wooden nightstand holding a flickering oil lamp. A weathered desk provided a space for contemplation, its surface adorned with a modest vase of wildflowers, infusing the room with a touch of delicate beauty. "You settle in now, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "If you need anything, just holler." Walls a testament to the tales it held within. As Clyde entered the boarding house, a sense of nostalgia washed over him. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and the lingering aroma of home-cooked meals. The sound of laughter and animated conversations wafted from the common area, where weary travelers and local townsfolk gathered to share their stories. Mrs. Henderson, the matronly figure who presided over the boarding house, greeted Clyde with a warm smile. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes sparkled with a wisdom earned through years of hosting travelers from far and wide. She had a way of making everyone feel like they belonged. "Evening, stranger," she said, her voice carrying a comforting timbre. "Jeb mentioned you might be stopping by. Got a room ready for you, if you're interested." Clyde glanced around the cozy foyer, taking in the warm but lovingly maintained furnishings. The walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper, reminiscent of a bygone era. A crackling fireplace cast a gentle glow, its warmth inviting weary souls to find respite from the harshness of the world outside. He nodded appreciatively and followed Mrs. Henderson down the narrow hallway. The sound of his boots against the polished wooden floor echoed through the corridor, creating a comforting rhythm. As they passed the open doors of occupied rooms, snippets of conversations and hushed whispers reached Clyde's ears, painting a vivid tapestry of the diverse characters seeking refuge under this roof. The room assigned to Clyde was simple but inviting. A comfortable bed with a patchwork quilt took center stage, flanked by a well-worn wooden nightstand holding a flickering oil lamp. A weathered desk provided a space for contemplation, its surface adorned with a modest vase of wildflowers, infusing the room with a touch of delicate beauty. "You settle in now, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "If you need anything, just holler. We're like a family here, and we look after each other." Clyde nodded, handing her a few coins. "I appreciate it, ma'am." "Oh, it's not necessary," said Mr. Henderson. Clyde expressed his gratitude with a nod and watched as Mrs. Henderson closed the door behind her, leaving him to his thoughts. The room became a sanctuary, shielding him from the harsh realities of the outside world. He found solace in its familiarity, a temporary respite in his relentless pursuit of justice. As the shadows lengthened and the day drew to a close, Clyde sank into the worn armchair by the window. He gazed out at the twilight settling upon the town, its amber hues casting a sense of tranquility over the bustling streets. In this moment, within the embrace of the boarding house, Clyde felt a glimmer of hope amidst the shadows of his past. After settling into his room, Clyde's eyes were drawn to the wanted posters adorning the wall. His heart skipped a beat as he spotted the familiar faces of Brian Carter and the Bones Gang, their crimes and the rewards for their capture prominently displayed. The reward for Brian Carter was a staggering $20,000, a fortune that could change Clyde's life forever. A fire burned within Clyde, fueled by a desire for justice and revenge. He knew he couldn't let these outlaws roam free, terrorizing others as they had terrorized him. His hands clenched into fists as memories of his family's tragedy flooded his mind. Clyde woke up early the next morning, his mind filled with determination and a touch of apprehension. He made his way downstairs to the cozy dining area of the boarding house, where Mrs. Henderson greeted him with a warm smile. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, adding to the inviting atmosphere. "Good morning, Clyde," Mrs. Henderson said cheerfully, setting a plate of steaming breakfast in front of him. "I hope you slept well. You'll need a hearty meal to start your day." Clyde nodded gratefully and took a sip of the hot coffee. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. It smells delicious." The two engaged in light conversation, discussing the weather and the recent happenings in Dusty Creek. Mrs. Henderson's friendly demeanor put Clyde at ease, and for a moment, he could almost forget the weight of his mission. As they continued to chat, Clyde noticed a subtle change in Mrs. Henderson's expression. Her warm smile faded slightly, replaced by a hint of sadness and concern. "You know, Clyde," she began hesitantly, her eyes searching his, "this town has seen its fair share of trouble. We've had our share of outlaws passing through, causing chaos and leaving a trail of destruction. The Bones Gang. They've brought nothing but pain to innocent folks around here. Clyde's heart sank as he realized he had unintentionally touched a painful nerve. He understood the grief and fear that lingered in the town's collective memory, the scars left by the very criminals he sought to bring to justice. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson," Clyde replied softly, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I didn't mean to bring up such painful memories. I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure the Bones Gang pays for their crimes." Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened, and she placed a comforting hand on Clyde's. "I know you will, Clyde. I can see the determination in your eyes. Just be careful, my dear. These men are ruthless, and they won't hesitate to use violence." Clyde nodded, acknowledging the warning. "I'll be as careful as I can, Mrs. Henderson. I won't let their reign of terror continue." Feeling the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, Clyde quickly changed the subject, asking about the local landmarks and any notable places he should be aware of in his search for justice. Mrs. Henderson obliged, sharing stories of Dusty Creek's history and pointing out areas of interest. With a sense of renewed purpose, Clyde finished his breakfast, expressing his gratitude to Mrs. Henderson for her hospitality. He stood up from the table, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," he said sincerely. "I appreciate your kindness and words of caution. I won't forget them." Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly, her earlier sadness replaced by a glimmer of hope. "Take care, Clyde. The town is counting on you." Clyde tipped his hat respectfully, his determination renewed. "I won't let them down." With that, Clyde left the boarding house, his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew the road would be treacherous, but he was ready to confront the darkness and bring justice to those who had caused so much pain. Determined, Clyde stepped out into the fading light of day. The poster of Brian Carter etched into his memory. He knew that many other bounty hunters would be after that reward, but Clyde was driven by a personal vendetta. He wouldn't rest until justice was served. As he made his way through the town of Dusty Creek, Clyde couldn't help but take in the sights and sounds that surrounded him. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, while a gentle breeze whispered through the aging buildings. The town had an air of both ruggedness and resilience, as if each weathered structure held secrets and stories of its own. The wooden storefronts, their paint faded and peeling, showcased a colorful array of businesses. A general store with its shelves stocked with provisions stood alongside a bustling saloon, its swinging doors inviting patrons to seek refuge from the harsh realities of the West. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from a nearby bakery, mingling with the fragrant scent of brewing coffee that emanated from the local cafe. The townsfolk moved with a sense of purpose, their faces etched with the hardships they had endured. Men in worn-out hats and dusty boots crossed paths with women in modest dresses, their eyes reflecting both resilience and weariness. 2 children, a young boy and a girl, played in the dirt streets, their laughter filling the air with a reminder of innocence amidst the harshness of the frontier. Amidst this backdrop, Clyde's gaze was drawn to the figure of another bounty hunter. The man stood out with his wiry frame and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face. In his hand he held a wanted poster adorned with the faces of the notorious Bones Gang. The sizable reward of $40,000 emblazoned on the poster acted as a tempting lure for the less scrupulous souls who sought to profit from the gang's capture. Clyde's eyes narrowed as he observed the bounty hunter's demeanor. There was a hunger for wealth in the man's gaze, a greed that threatened to consume any sense of justice or righteousness. It was a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead, not only in his pursuit of the Bones Gang but also in navigating a world where morality often took a back seat to personal gain. With a firm resolve, Clyde continued his path, knowing that he would need to outmaneuver not only the outlaws he sought but also the opportunistic souls who sought to claim the reward for themselves. The town of Dusty Creek, with all its charm and grit, had become the battleground for justice, and Clyde was determined to ensure that true justice prevailed, no matter the cost. Their eyes met, and the tension in the air was palpable. The other bounty hunter sauntered towards Clyde, a hand resting casually on the hilt of his revolver. Well, what do we have here? Fancy your chances at that reward, stranger?" Clyde's voice was steady, laced with determination. "I've got my eyes set on Brian Carter. But I won't hesitate to take down any of the Bones gang that gets in my way." A crooked grin twisted the bounty hunter's face. "You're a bold one. We'll see if you can back up those words." With a swift motion, he drew his hand near his revolver and loosened the holster, the metallic click echoing through the tense silence. As the first rays of moonlight illuminated the deserted street, Clyde and the bounty hunter faced each other, their eyes locked in a deadly duel of wills. The sound of a distant tumbleweed rolling by was the only sign of life in the deserted town. The stage was set, and the lone survivor was about to make his first move in the relentless pursuit of justice. "It doesn't have to be like this," said Clyde, his piercing gaze fixed on the nameless bounty hunter standing before him. His hand hovered over his gun holster, ready to draw at a moment's notice. Clyde's trusted weapon, a Colt single-action army revolver, was a formidable sight. Its polished steel gleamed under the sunlight, reflecting the harshness of the unforgiving western landscape. The ivory grip showcased intricate engravings, hinting at a past filled with battles and bloodshed. This gun had been his loyal companion through countless encounters, a symbol of his determination for justice. Clad in rugged attire, Clyde wore a well-worn leather gun holster slung low on his hip, allowing for a swift and efficient draw. The holster had seen its fair share of action, with scuff marks and faded stains bearing witness to past confrontations. It was a testament to his experience and resilience in the face of danger. The nameless bounty hunter, dressed in a dusty black duster, exuded an air of danger. His weathered face bore the scars of previous battles, a testament to a life lived on the edge. His eyes, as cold and unforgiving as the barrel of a gun, locked onto Clyde's with a mix of hostility and determination. His unkempt hair and unshaven face hinted at a life spent chasing bounties and surviving on the fringes of society. As tension filled the air, both men prepared for the inevitable duel, each driven by their own motivations. A young boy watched from behind a corner of a building to the left, while a man watched from his window to the right. The weight of past decisions and the consequences of their actions hung heavy in the moment, fueling the intensity of the impending clash. Chapter 2. The Seasoned Gunslinger. Gunfire erupted in the deserted street of Dusty Creek as Clyde's hand moved like lightning, his aim true. The other bounty hunter, caught off guard by Clyde's speed and accuracy, fell to the ground in a cloud of dust, his revolver slipping from his lifeless fingers. Clyde stood there, his heart pounding, as the realization of what he had just done settled in. He holstered his weapon, knowing that this was just the beginning of the battles he would face on his quest for vengeance. Clyde spun his gun and dropped it back into his holster and started slowly walking over to the nameless bounty hunter's body slumped on the ground. The sound of creaking wood from a loose salon door as he passed and neared the dead man. Clyde leaned down and took the rolled-up wanted poster from inside the nameless one's jacket and unrolled it. The wanted poster had a bullet hole right through Brian's head. The rest of his gang stood aside him on their horses. Clyde smiled to himself and rolled the poster up and away again and tucked it in his inner pocket, then walked back to the bar. Meanwhile, in the smoky interior of the saloon, Frank leaned against the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. His sharp eyes had caught the commotion outside, and he watched the aftermath of the duel with a detached interest. Frank was no stranger to the violence that permeated the Wild West, having weathered countless showdowns and walked away unscathed. As Clyde stepped into the saloon, his dusty boots leaving marks on the wooden floor, he caught Frank's gaze. Their eyes met briefly, a mutual understanding passing between them. Frank recognized the fire in Clyde's eyes, a fire that burned with a singular purpose, a purpose Frank knew all too well. The saloon was abuzz with activity, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and the sound of laughter mingling with clinking glasses. Clyde scanned the room, his senses sharpened by the events of the day. He overheard snippets of conversation, catching whispers about the notorious Bones gang. Eager to gather information, Clyde sidled up to the bar, his presence commanding attention. He ordered a drink, his gaze darting around the room as he listened for any valuable tidbits of knowledge. A grizzled old miner, his face weathered by years spent in the harsh wilderness, leaned against the bar next to Clyde. The miner's voice was rough, tinged with a hint of excitement as he spoke to the bartender. "Did you hear? The Bones gang is rumored to be planning their biggest heist yet. They're targeting a shipment of gold that's due to pass through these parts. It's said to be heavily guarded." Clyde's ears perked up at the mention of the Bones gang's plans. He knew he had to find a way to intercept them before they could carry out their audacious scheme. His mind raced with strategies and possibilities, each thought bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. Unbeknownst to Clyde, Frank continued to observe him from the shadows of the saloon. He recognized the fire burning within Clyde, the determination that mirrored his own. Frank had seen countless men driven by revenge, their hearts consumed by darkness. But something about Clyde intrigued him, a flicker of empathy buried deep within his hardened soul. As the night wore on, Clyde and Frank remained in the saloon, their paths entwined by destiny and the pursuit of justice. They exchanged fleeting glances, their unspoken connection strengthening with each passing moment. Little did they know that their paths were about to converge in a way either of them could have anticipated. The hunt for the Bones gang was just beginning, and the Wild West would bear witness to the clash of two formidable gunslingers. As the night wore on, the saloon became livelier, the raucous laughter and clinking of glasses filling the air. Clyde and Frank found themselves sitting at adjacent tables, each lost in their own thoughts, yet aware of the other's presence. Clyde's eyes wandered over the room, studying the faces of the patrons, searching for any signs of the Bones gang or potential allies in his quest. The flickering lanterns cast an amber glow on the worn faces of miners, cowboys, and gamblers who had sought solace and excitement within the saloon's walls. In a corner of the room, a boisterous poker game was underway. Clyde caught snippets of conversation, whispers of rumors that echoed through the haze of smoke. The mention of a large gold shipment and the words, "Bones gang," piqued his interest. He discreetly edged closer, straining to eavesdrop on their discussion. Frank, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced vigilance. He observed the various players, noting their movements and the hidden stories etched on their faces. The air was heavy with anticipation, a tangible energy that signaled something significant was about to unfold. As Clyde listened intently, a rugged cowboy with a worn Stetson caught his eye. The cowboy's weathered features hinted at a life spent under the scorching sun. Clyde recognized the look of a man who had faced adversity head-on. Seizing the opportunity, Clyde approached the cowboy and leaned against the bar, striking up a casual conversation. "Evening, partner. Mind if I join you for a drink?" The cowboy nodded, offering a curt smile. No harm in sharing a drink. Name's Jed. Clyde, he replied, raising his glass in acknowledgement. So, Jed, you ever heard anything about the Bones gang around these parts? Jed took a long swig of his whiskey, his eyes glimmering with a mix of caution and curiosity. I've heard whispers. They're rumored to be planning their biggest heist yet, targeting a shipment of gold that's passing through these lands. But mark my words, they ain't ones to mess with. Clyde's jaw tightened, the desire for justice burning in his eyes. I aim to make 'em pay for what they did, Jed. Any chance you might know where I can find 'em? Jed paused for a moment, his gaze scanning the room before leaning in closer to Clyde. Word is, they've been seen camped near Dead Man's Pass, a treacherous stretch of land not too far from here. But be careful, friend. The Bones gang is ruthless, and they won't hesitate to spill blood. Clyde nodded, a steely resolve shining in his eyes. Thanks for the tip, Jed. I won't forget this. As the night wore on, Clyde and Frank exchanged occasional glances, their silent understanding growing stronger. They were two lone wolves on the hunt, their paths destined to intertwine in the pursuit of justice. Outside the saloon, the winds howled, carrying with them the whispers of fate. The Wild West was about to bear witness to a showdown unlike any other, where the lines between law and vengeance would blur and the choices made would reverberate through the annals of history. The saloon's atmosphere grew charged with an undercurrent of anticipation as the night wore on. Clyde and Frank, both aware of the other's presence, remained immersed in their own thoughts, their paths on the verge of converging. Clyde's eyes flickered towards Frank, studying the seasoned gunslinger from a distance. Frank exuded an aura of quiet confidence, his weathered face a canvas of countless battles fought and won. Clyde couldn't help but admire the man's skill and experience, sensing a kindred spirit beneath the hardened exterior. As Clyde nursed his drink, a commotion erupted at one end of the saloon. The swinging doors swung open, revealing a group of rowdy cowboys stumbling in, their laughter ringing through the air. Among them was Doug Walters, a hulking figure with a reputation for ruthless brutality. Doug's eyes scanned the room, the glint of mischief in his gaze as he sized up the patrons. His gaze landed on Clyde, a spark of recognition igniting within his cold, calculating eyes. Clyde's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, ready to defend himself if necessary. However, before tensions could escalate, Doug's attention shifted to a lively poker game in the corner. He nudged his companions, his voice laced with mischief. Looks like our luck's about to change, boys. Let's join in on the action. Clyde took this opportunity to observe the interaction, his senses heightened. He couldn't help but notice the camaraderie among the members of the Bones gang, their unspoken language and shared history evident in their every move. Frank, ever the astute observer, had also taken notice of the gang's arrival. His keen eyes studied each member, committing their faces to memory. He recognized the dangers they posed, their reputation well-deserved. As the night progressed, the Bones gang indulged in revelry, their laughter and boisterous voices filling the saloon. Their presence became a reminder of the impending danger Clyde and Frank faced, fueling their resolve to bring these outlaws to justice. Clyde's gaze shifted back to Frank, his eyes conveying a silent message, a message of unity in their shared pursuit. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that their paths were destined to intertwine in this treacherous game of cat and mouse. With the tension mounting, Clyde made a decision. He approached the poker table where the Bones gang was engrossed in their game, a mask of confidence concealing the fire burning within. Clyde's purpose was twofold: gather information and test the boundaries of these ruthless outlaws. Pulling up a chair, Clyde took a seat at the table, his gaze meeting Doug's with unwavering determination. Mind if I join you, gentlemen? Doug eyed Clyde, a mixture of amusement and curiosity in his eyes. He leaned back, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. Well, what do we have here? A brave soul stepping into the lion's den. Sure, take a seat. Let's see if you can handle the heat. As the cards were dealt and the game unfolded, Clyde's mind raced, his senses attuned to every detail. He engaged in casual banter with the gang members, extracting tidbits of information while concealing his true intentions. Meanwhile, Frank watched the proceedings from a distance, his eyes trained on Clyde. He recognized the audacity and cunning behind Clyde's actions, admiring the younger bounty hunter's ability to navigate the dangerous territory of the Bones gang. In the heart of the saloon, amidst the clatter of chips and the flickering glow of lanterns, the fates of Clyde and Frank drew closer. Their shared pursuit of justice had brought them to this pivotal moment, where alliances would be formed, and the Wild West would witness the clash of relentless determination against ruthless savagery. The tension in the saloon mounted as Clyde skillfully played his hand, his poker face betraying nothing but cool confidence. The Bones gang members watched him closely, their expressions a mix of curiosity and suspicion. As the game progressed, Clyde subtly steered the conversation towards the topic of the Bones gang's recent activities. He probed for information, his words carefully chosen to avoid raising suspicion. The gang, fueled by whiskey and bravado, let slip small details about their plans and their leader, Brian Carter. Only 2 members of the Bones gang were here tonight, Doug and Fred, with 2 hangers-on who likely wanted to look tough to the locals by hanging with members of the Bones gang for a while. Sitting at the bar, Frank's gaze never wavered from the unfolding scene. He saw Clyde's deft maneuvers and his deliberate attempts to extract crucial information. Frank admired the younger bounty hunter's strategy, recognizing his determination to bring down the infamous Bones gang. Doug, the imposing figurehead of the gang, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Clyde. A slow, cunning smile crept across his face, revealing his enjoyment of the high-stakes game at hand. He had a reputation for being perceptive, and he sensed there was more to Clyde than met the eye. "You've got some nerve, stranger," Doug remarked, his voice dripping with smugness. "But I reckon you're not just here for a friendly game of poker. What's your real game, huh?" Clyde's gaze met Doug's, a steely resolve burning in his eyes. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in the Bones gang. They've caused a lot of pain, and it's time someone made them pay." The gang members Doug and Fred exchanged knowing glances, their expressions hardening. Clyde's words struck a nerve, unearthing buried memories and igniting a flicker of recognition in some of their eyes. Doug, a hardened and long-time member of the Bones gang, glanced at Clyde, a spark of curiosity glinting in his gaze. Sensing the mounting tension, the saloon fell into an uneasy silence. The patrons could feel the electricity in the air, the palpable clash between 2 forces on a collision course. Suddenly, without warning, Doug's hand shot towards his revolver. His intent was clear, questioning Clyde's loyalty with the duel, a test of skill and survival. The saloon erupted into chaos as people scrambled to clear the area, creating a circle for the impending showdown. Clyde's hand hovered over his own gun, his eyes narrowing with unwavering determination. He knew this duel was more than just a test of skill, it was a pivotal moment that could determine the course of his vendetta against the Bones gang. Their eyes locked, Clyde and Doug exchanged a few tense words, their voices laced with a dangerous mix of bravado and quiet resolve. The saloon fell into an expectant silence, the only sound cutting through the air being the creaking of leather and the whispers of fate. In one swift motion, the dueling pistols were drawn, their barrels aimed with deadly intent. The crowd held their breath as the seconds stretched into eternity. Then, with lightning speed, the gunshots rang out, shattering the stillness. Time seemed to stand still as Clyde's bullet found its mark, piercing Doug's shoulder. The force of the impact sent him sprawling to the floor, his own shot flying wide. Clyde quickly stood up and let out another bullet piercing Doug's chest, killing him almost instantly. Doug slid on the floor and let out his last groan. Clyde stood there, his chest heaving, the taste of victory mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The duel had been won, a testament to his skill and determination. He cast a steely gaze across the saloon, his eyes meeting Frank's once again. Freed and his two hangers-on slowly backed off. Fred had his hand just above his gun holster and exited through the saloon doors, with his two frightened friends. "You won't get away with this, boy," said Fred, backing out of the saloon doors with his companions. Frank nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The hunt for the Bones gang had taken an unexpected turn, and together, they would chart a course through treacherous territory. As their paths converged, their fates intertwined, they embarked on a dangerous journey towards justice in the untamed Wild West. Chapter 3. A pivotal encounter. The saloon erupted in a mix of cheers and startled gasps as the smoke from the duel lingered in the air. Clyde, adrenaline coursing through his veins, holstered his gun with practiced ease. His gaze shifted from the fallen Doug to the stunned members of the Bones gang. Amidst the chaos, Frank emerged from the shadows, his eyes fixed on Clyde. There was a flicker of admiration in Frank's gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the younger bounty hunter's skill and determination. The two men shared a brief nod, an unspoken agreement forming between them. With the dust settling, the saloon gradually returned to its raucous state, albeit with an undercurrent of tension. The Bones gang, momentarily stunned by the unexpected turn of events, exchanged glances laden with uncertainty and anger. Clyde, aware of the brewing storm, maintained a calm facade as he approached the bar. He ordered a drink, the amber liquid providing a momentary respite from the chaos that surrounded him. As he sipped, his gaze wandered, landing on the body of Doug, the notorious member of the Bones gang. A local young man approached Clyde and offered to wrap the body and take it for the bounty for a percentage of the reward. Clyde offered the guy $500 and he acceded. Clyde leaned on the bar and ordered a drink. In the corner of the saloon, Frank leaned against a wooden pillar, his eyes keenly surveying the scene. He understood Clyde's need for patience, for careful planning. The pursuit of justice required strategy, and Frank was willing to play the long game. A young woman sat at the piano while a man next her asked her to play a tune, so the piano music began and people started quietly chatting. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the saloon remained charged with an unspoken tension. The Bones gang members, fueled by their wounded pride, would be out there somewhere together, like a pack of wolves plotting their next move. Clyde asked around in the bar, seizing the opportunity to gather more information. He discreetly approached the locals, engaging in hushed conversations, coaxing whispers of the Bones gang's recent activities. The town's whispers revealed whispers of potential hideouts, secret rendezvous points, and the gang's uncanny ability to evade capture. Outside the saloon, the night grew darker, casting an ominous shadow over the town of Dusty Creek. The echoes of the past reverberated through its streets, intertwining with the present, creating a tapestry of destiny and revenge. The saloon hummed with an undercurrent of anticipation as Clyde and Frank continued their separate investigations. Their paths converged once again when a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance. The swing of the saloon doors revealed a menacing figure, Fred, a member of the Bones gang, his eyes glinting with a dangerous resolve. His gaze locked onto Frank, recognizing him as a formidable adversary. The tension in the room escalated as the air thickened with the scent of imminent conflict. Fred's eyes locked onto Clyde. "You're a dead man!" "You're both dead men," said Fred. Without uttering a word, Frank calmly stepped forward, his hand hovering above his trusted revolver. Fred, the gang member, mirrored his stance, his fingers twitching with a mix of fear and determination. The saloon patrons instinctively scattered, creating a ring of space, eager to witness the clash of two seasoned gunslingers. Silence descended upon the room. broken only by the faint creaking of floorboards and the pounding of hearts. Frank's eyes bore into his opponent's, a reflection of years of experience and the countless duels he had survived. Fred, fueled by loyalty and a desperate desire to prove himself, met Frank's gaze with a mixture of bravado and trepidation. Time seemed to suspend as the seconds stretched into an eternity. In that fleeting moment, the Wild West held its breath, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of the impending duel. "Remember Alice, Frank?" said Fred. "There doesn't have to be any more killing here tonight," replied Frank calmly. Silence filled the room held by the tension. Fred looked around the room, saw people frozen in fear, then he spat on the floor. "You're right, not here anyway." Fred moved his hands slowly away from his gun and stepped back to leave the saloon. "But how are you and your friend going to sleep tonight? I wonder?" said Fred, backing out of the saloon doors with his two hangers-on beside him. "Good night, boys," said Fred as he left, his two friends laughing alongside him as they left the bar with him. Silence settled over the saloon, broken only by the distant howling wind. As the saloon gradually returned to its previous state of revelry, a new wave of tension settled over the room. The Bones gang members, witnessing the downfall of their comrade, would no doubt be close by somewhere planning a revenge attack. Clyde and Frank, each having their own battles, locked eyes once more. They understood that the road ahead would be treacherous and fraught with danger. But they also knew that their combined determination and skills would be their greatest assets in the pursuit of the Bones gang. "Listen, kid, this might be our last night, so let's drink to it," Frank said, holding his glass up to Clyde at the bar. "Don't worry about it. I don't think they'll attack tonight," said Jed, approaching Clyde and Frank at the bar. "What makes you think that?" said Frank, frowning. "They'd got a train to catch, remember?" smiled Jed, and then taking a drink he put his glass down. "If you guys need any help?" Clyde looked Jed over and then looked to Frank. Frank and Clyde exchanged glances, then Clyde faced Jed again. "Thanks, Jed, but I think we can manage this one ourselves." Clyde leaned back on the bar to drink. "But I'm a decent shooter," said Jed. Frank smiled from behind his whiskey glass, amused by the youngsters' enthusiasm to join in their dangerous pursuit. "Listen, kid, it's better to stay safe than trying to be the hero. I don't want anyone on my conscience," said Clyde. Jed seemed a bit disappointed that he couldn't join them and walked away to sit at a table on his own. Frank glanced at Clyde and looked him over, thinking to himself, wondering if Jed could be of any use. "You know, maybe you should take your own advice?" said Frank. Clyde slowly turned to face Frank. "What do you mean? It's better to be safe than trying to be the hero," said Frank. "I can do this on my own. I don't need anyone's help," said Clyde, leaning on the bar. "Sure," said Frank before taking a drink of whiskey. Clyde gave Frank a look, then Frank spoke. "All I'm saying is, you might stand more chance against the gang if you got me." Frank looks over to Jed, sat alone at the table, and says, "And Jed is back up." Frank turned back round and leaned on the bar. "How do I know I can trust you? Or trust Jed not to slip or miss?" Clyde asked Frank, and Frank didn't seem to have any answers. "I've been let down too many times before, mister," said Clyde. "I'm sure you have, kid," said Frank, and was interrupted by Clyde saying, "And don't call me kid." Frank leaned back in his chair. "So what's your name?" "My name is Frank," said Frank. Clyde quietly spoke. "Clyde, but don't to use my name here." "Okay, nice to meet you. How many men have you shot, kid?" said Frank, pouring himself another drink. "You look like you can handle yourself well. I'd bet you shot a lot of people already." Frank was beginning to slur a little when talking. Clyde didn't answer and was leaning thoughtfully on the bar. "I lost count, after about 100, but I reckon it could be 150 men, at least," said Frank, putting the cap back on his bottle. Clyde was taken aback by how many men Frank had shot in his time and took his time to reply. 5, said Clyde. 5? Well, that's still cold. Do you remember how you felt after the first one? What were you thinking after? Frank took a drink of his whiskey. Clyde was lost in though for a while and didn't answer Frank directly. "I took a lot of men in alive," said Clyde. "It's nice when that they come nicely these days. I could never do that. It never seemed possible," said Frank. I never wanted to kill a man. I would rather they were took in alive and given a trail and a chance," said Clyde with a sense of honor and morals. Frank wobbled about putting his glass back on the bar. "I never wanted to either, but I couldn't risk it. Most these men would put a bullet in me without even thinking about it, back then, and these Bones gang are like that. The Carters are mean gunslingers, my friend. Fred and Harry are also notorious killers. You've been very lucky tonight," Frank said. Clyde adjusted himself against the bar, observing Frank. "You need to slow down with the whiskey, my friend," said Frank. "I wonder how many men Jed has shot? Shall we ask him?" Frank gestured with his hand to get Jed's attention. "Hey Jed, come over here. Have a drink with us," said Frank. Jed stood upon his denim dungarees and walked over toward Frank and Clyde. "How many men have you shot, Jed?" said Frank. I shot 2 men who were beating on my gran. I shot them dead last year," said Jed as he took a drink offered from Frank. "What did it feel like, Jed?" said Frank. I felt good. I felt relieved. These guys had already beaten on her and my granddad, so I had to do something," said Jed. "You did the right thing, Jed," said Frank. "Yeah, enjoy your drink," said Clyde. Frank leaned in closer, his expression serious and empathetic. "Jed, sometimes life forces us into difficult situations where there's no easy way out. You did what you had to do to protect your family, and that's what matters most. Out here, survival sometimes means making tough choices." Jed nodded, appreciating Frank's understanding. "Thanks, Frank. I just hope I never have to go through something like that again." Frank took a deep breath and then leaned back, looking into the distance as he began recounting his own harrowing experience. "I know what you mean, Jed. I've been in a few tough spots myself. There was this one time a few years back when I had a showdown with a gunslinger called Wild Will Thornton." As Frank spoke, Clyde and Jed listened intently, captivated by the tale of a legendary gunfight. It was a dusty afternoon, and the whole town gathered to watch the duel. Will Thornton was a notorious gunslinger, the fastest draw in the West, and he had a reputation for killing anyone who challenged him. Frank paused for a moment, remembering the tension and fear he felt that day. "I knew I couldn't back down. He'd shot down a friend of mine just days before, and I had to avenge him. So there we were, facing each other on the dusty main street. The sun beat down on us like a fiery inferno. The townsfolk were whispering, waiting for the first move. We stood there, eyes locked, and then it happened. Will went for his gun, and I drew mine in the same heartbeat. It was like time slowed down, and every little detail became crystal clear. I fired, and I saw my bullet hit his shoulder. But before I could even register the hit, Will's bullet grazed my left elbow. The pain was excruciating, but I couldn't let it show. I gritted my teeth and kept going." Frank took a moment to touch the old wound on his left elbow. The memory's still vivid after all those years. "We exchanged a few more shots, and it felt like an eternity. Finally, my last bullet found its mark, and Wild Will Thornton fell to the ground. He was still alive, but he was defeated. The whole town erupted in cheers, but I was in no mood to celebrate. My arm was bleeding, and my heart was heavy from taking another man's life, even if it was in self-defense." Jed looked at Frank with admiration and respect, realizing the weight of the experiences the older man carried. "You're a true gunslinger, Frank. I don't know if I could ever handle something like that." Frank gave Jed a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You never know what life will throw your way, Jed. Just remember, being a gunslinger isn't about seeking violence. It's about protecting the ones you love and standing up for what's right, even when it's tough." Clyde nodded in agreement, adding, "Frank's right, Jed. We've all seen our share of challenges out here. It's a tough world, but we'll get through it together." As the conversation shifted, the 3 men shared a brief moment of camaraderie, knowing that their paths had intertwined for a reason. They were bound by a shared journey and a collective sense of justice. "There's no real law or justice out here, is there, Jed, and sometimes we gotta do what have to," said Frank. "I shot another man," said Jed. Frank put his glass down in amazement, wanting to hear Jed's account. He was stealing a horse from our farm, I warned him, but he pulled his gun. I had to shoot him. Jed sounded upset when he spoke, almost crying. Frank sat facing Jed and his eye began to gather tears. It's all right, Jed, you did what you had to. Frank seemed a bit down now, as if Jed's stories had stirred something in his own memories. Frank broke down sobbing, and in the end it was Jed reassuring Frank. Jed held Frank as Frank sobbed. He had a family. 2 children, and I told him, don't do it. Don't you dare. Frank sobbed. Can't we find him a room? Clyde said to Jed. Jed asked the barman if he had a room, but Frank stood up and wiped his face. I'm okay, it's all right, he said, and the barman returned to his work. So are we in this together? Frank looked at Clyde and Jed. Clyde nodded. But we play it my way, Frank asked. So what's the plan? We interrupt their robbery, said Clyde, and the 3 of them smiled at each other before taking a drink in the depths of Dusty Creek. A plan was set in motion, fueled by a thirst for justice and a desire to confront the demons of their past. The lone survivor and the seasoned gunslinger would forge an alliance born out of tragedy, with Jed helping them out as they ventured deeper into the heart of the Wild West. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. Part 1. In the aftermath of their separate encounters, Clyde and Frank found themselves drawn together by a common purpose: capturing Brian Carter and dismantling the infamous Bones Gang. Their paths converged in Dusty Creek, a small town teetering on the edge of lawlessness. Wary gazes met as Clyde and Frank assessed each other, their hardened expressions a reflection of the dangers they had faced. Jed alongside them on his horse, listening in quietly. Those strangers, they understood the value of collaboration in a land where justice was scarce. A tense silence lingered between them, each man weighing the risks and benefits of forging an alliance. Clyde, his eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, broke the silence. I've been hunting the Bones Gang for years, he confessed, his voice laced with a mix of determination and pain. They took everything from me, a family I'll never see again. I want justice, and I won't rest until Brian Carter pays for his crimes. Frank's piercing gaze softened for a moment, acknowledging the weight of Clyde's words. I understand your thirst for justice, he replied, his voice steady and resolute. We both have our reasons for pursuing Carter and his gang. If we join forces, our chances of success increase. Together, we can bring them down. Jed, sensing the somber mood, interjected with a hint of optimism. Hey, Mr. Wilson might have a map we could use, he suggested, his voice eager. We should swing by his place first. It might give us an edge in tracking the gang. Clyde's face remained stoic, his mind consumed by thoughts of revenge. We can't afford to waste time, he retorted, mounting his horse with a sense of urgency. We need to catch up with the Bones Gang before they slip away. Undeterred, Jed darted off, promising to return shortly. Clyde and Frank exchanged a cautious glance, silently acknowledging the unspoken trust that had begun to form between them. A few minutes later, Jed reappeared, holding a rolled-up map in his hand. Look, it's a shortcut, Jed exclaimed, unrolling the map and tracing his finger along a rugged path. If we cut through Deadman's Pass, we can save a lot of time. It'll lead us right to their hideout. A glimmer of admiration flickered in Clyde's eyes as he regarded Jed. Well done, Jed, he commended, his voice laced with gratitude. That shortcut will come in handy. Let's not waste any more time. We have a gang to catch. With their spirits momentarily lifted by the prospect of a strategic advantage, the trio set off, their horses galloping through the untamed wilderness. The journey ahead was treacherous, but with determination fueling their every step. They rode on, ready to face the gathering storm that awaited them. Frank studied Clyde, recognizing the raw determination that burned within him. The seasoned gunslinger knew the weight of revenge and the toll it took on a man's soul. With a nod, he acknowledged Clyde's words, his own resolve strengthening. "You're not alone in seeking justice," Frank replied, his voice steady and unwavering. "The Bones gang has left a trail of blood and destruction in their wake. They need to be stopped, and I aim to see it done." A glimmer of understanding passed between them, an unspoken agreement that their combined skills and determination could tip the scales in their favor. As tension loosened its grip, an uneasy alliance began to take shape, like the gathering storm on the horizon. Together, with Jed at their side, Clyde and Frank strategized, pooling their knowledge and resources. They delved into the depths of Dusty Creek, seeking information from the locals, whispers of the gang's hideouts, their latest escapades, and the vulnerabilities that could be exploited. In this fragile alliance, trust was a precious commodity, built on shared experiences and the mutual understanding of loss and the pursuit of justice. As Clyde opened up to Frank, he revealed the haunting memories that fueled his relentless pursuit. "I was just a young boy when the Bones gang swept through our homestead," Clyde confided, his voice tinged with a mix of sorrow and rage. "I witnessed the brutal murder of my family, left to carry that pain with me every day since. It's why I've dedicated my life to hunting them down." Frank listened, his eyes holding a depth of empathy that only a man who had stared into the abyss of darkness could truly understand. He recognized the unyielding fire within Clyde, a fire that mirrored his own. "We carry the weight of our past," Frank replied, his voice filled with a hardened resolve. "But together, we have a chance to confront those demons, to bring justice to those who have evaded it for far too long." Their shared understanding deepened the bond between them, solidifying their alliance. They knew the road ahead would be treacherous, with dangers lurking in every shadow. But united, they stood a chance against the formidable Bones gang. As the day unfolded, they won their horses and began traveling in pursuit of the Bones gang. The storm clouds gathered, both in the skies above and within the hearts of Clyde and Frank, and also Jed. Their quest for justice burned brighter, propelling them further into the heart of the Wild West, where their destinies would intertwine with those of the Bones gang. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over Dusty Creek, Clyde and Frank set their plan into motion. The alliance they forged began to take shape, their shared determination fueling their every step. Before reaching their short-cut path, Clyde slowed down and got a Phi's horse. JD and Frank slowed their horses down and watched as Clyde pointed at the map and said, "This is our shortcut. We've got about 4 hours to get across here." The gang has a preference for isolated locations," Clyde remarked, pointing at a particular spot on the map. "They'll seek refuge in the old abandoned mine outside of town. It's a treacherous place, but it offers them the seclusion they crave." Frank nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We strike when they least expect it. The cover of darkness will be our ally. We'll catch them off guard, disrupt their operations, and ensure they pay for the lives they've taken." Their plan began to take shape, a daring raid on the gang's hideout, a clash between justice and lawlessness. Clyde's desire for revenge fused with Frank's steadfast pursuit of bringing outlaws to justice. The two bounty hunters, once strangers, had become brothers in arms. As the moon ascended into the night sky, casting its ethereal glow over Dusty Creek, Clyde and Frank readied themselves for the impending confrontation. They strapped on their holsters, checking their weapons with a practiced hand. Clyde got back on his horse and they galloped along the dirt track shortcut route. Clyde's gaze met Frank's, a shared understanding passing between them. They knew that the battle ahead would be perilous, testing their mettle and their resolve. But they were prepared to face the storm head-on, united in purpose. With a determined nod, Clyde, Frank and Jed on their horses galloped out into the night. They were shadows in the moonlight, guided by the pursuit of justice, driven by the ghosts of their past. The gathering storm had reached its peak, crackling with the promise of reckoning. The lone survivor and the seasoned gunslinger, with Jed, were ready to face the darkness that awaited them, armed with their skills, their resolve, and the knowledge that they were not alone. Clyde, Frank, and Jed continued their swift gallop along the dirt track, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. As they neared a picturesque farmhouse nestled among rolling hills, a figure emerged from the front gate, clutching a shotgun tightly in his hands. The trio sensed the tension in the air and slowed their horses upon Frank's signal. With a calm yet commanding voice, Frank raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "Don't shoot. Put your gun down," he called out, projecting his voice to ensure he was heard. "We're just passing through these parts, sir. We don't mean any disturbance." The man eyed them cautiously, his weathered face etched with suspicion. "Who are you?" he grumbled, his grip on the shotgun unwavering. "We're looking for the Bones gang," Frank replied, his tone earnest. "Word is they're over the hill yonder, about to pull off a train robbery. We aim to stop them." The man remained skeptical, his gaze shifting from one rider to another. "Don't be trying no funny business," he warned, keeping his shotgun pointed in their direction. "You go by slowly and keep your hands up, you hear me?" The old man squinted his eyes, examining the three riders with suspicion. His shotgun remained steady, not wavering an inch. "Hold on now, let me get a good look at ye," he said, gesturing for Clyde to step forward. Clyde dismounted and cautiously approached, keeping his hands visible. The man's eyes fixated on Clyde's gun, and a glimmer of recognition flashed across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's an old Colt Frontier, ain't it?" Clyde nodded, surprised by the man's keen eye for firearms. "Yeah, it sure is. I've had it about 9 years. The man took the gun from Clyde's outstretched hand, studying it intently. "This here gun's got a history, I tell ya," he said. "Used to belong to that notorious Bones gang member, Brian Carter. He was quite the troublemaker back in the day." Clyde's eyes widened in astonishment. "Brian Carter, you say? What happened with this gun?" The man sighed, memories etched deep in his weathered face. "Over 10 years ago, the Bones gang rode into the town of Willow Creek," he began. "They held up the local bank and made off with a small fortune. I was the security guard on duty that day. They shot me, I nearly lost my leg. Barely been able to walk proper since. They shot and killed my pal Bob, the other security guard, that night. I've never been the same since," said the man. Clyde's grip on his hat tightened as he listened to the man's harrowing tale. "I'm sorry to hear that," Clyde said, the weight of the gun's history settling on his shoulders. "You watch out when you get near with those Bones lot," the man warned, handing the gun back to Clyde. "They don't mess around. Be careful out there. We'll be sure to keep our wits about us," Clyde replied, grateful for the man's advice. "Thank you for letting us pass." With that, the man lowered his shotgun and stepped back, allowing Clyde, Frank, and Jed to continue on their way. The encounter left a lingering sense of caution in their hearts as they rode further into the untamed wilderness, aware that they were venturing deeper into a world of danger and treachery. As the farmhouse faded in the distance, the trio's thoughts turned to the looming confrontation with the Bones gang. They knew they had to be prepared for whatever lay ahead, knowing that they were getting closer to the truth behind their past, their destinies intertwining with a notorious gang that had left a trail of pain and suffering across the land. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a golden hue across the vast expanse of the frontier. Clyde, Frank, and Jed rode onward into the fading light, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in their quest for justice and redemption. The echoes of the old man's warning reverberated in their minds, urging them to stay vigilant and never underestimate the dangers that lay ahead. The journey was far from over, and they were determined to see it through to the end. Together, they would strike at the heart of the Bones gang, unraveling the tapestry of violence and revenge that had plagued their lives for far too long. The storm had arrived, and it was time for Clyde and Frank to unleash its fury. Chapter 5. The Train Robbery. Part 1. The moon's pale light illuminated the rugged features of the Bones gang as they gathered near Deadman's Pass, an ominous setting that matched their nefarious intentions. Brian Carter, the imposing leader with a rugged beard and a worn leather hat, exuded a menacing presence. Dressed in a tattered black duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat, he exuded an air of calculated danger. Beside Brian, George, a wiry and scrappy individual with a scar running across his cheek, eagerly discussed the final intricacies of their plan. He adjusted his worn leather gloves, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Remember, no mistakes. We take down the guards, grab the loot, and disappear like smoke," George advised with a hint of cunning in his voice. Meanwhile, Harry, one of the oldest and largest members of the gang, towered over the others with a massive frame and a bushy beard that concealed his weathered face. He leaned against a tree, his muscular arms crossed, exuding an aura of quiet strength. Clad in a vest adorned with bullet casings and a worn-out Stetson hat, he possessed a commanding presence. "Keep your eyes sharp, boys. We ain't leaving empty-handed," Harry rumbled, his deep voice resonating with authority. Reg, a tall and muscular figure with a weathered face, stood nearby, meticulously inspecting his double-barreled shotgun. He wore a worn leather jacket adorned with bullet holes, a testament to his numerous encounters. With a nod of approval, he locked eyes with Brian. "I've been itching for a good fight," Reg grumbled, his gravelly voice betraying his eagerness to unleash chaos upon their unsuspecting victims. Fred, the lanky and quick-witted member of the gang, adjusted his worn bandana and sharpened the edges of his throwing knives. Dressed in a faded denim jacket adorned with patches of various outlaw insignias, he possessed a mischievous charm. "Remember, boys, stay alert. We don't want any surprises ruining our payday," Fred cautioned, his voice dripping with a mix of confidence and caution. Brian, his eyes glinting with a mix of authority and determination, placed a reassuring hand on Harry's broad shoulder. "We've planned this meticulously, Harry. Trust in our skills. Today, we make our mark," Brian declared, his words carrying a sense of conviction that resonated with the entire gang. With their weapons primed and their minds set on the impending heist, the Bones gang awaited the arrival of the train, their hearts pounding with a heady mix of excitement and trepidation. The stage was set for their audacious act of lawlessness, and the West trembled in anticipation of their next move. Meanwhile, Clyde and Frank, having gathered crucial information about the gang's activities, found themselves on the outskirts of the rugged canyon. They had learned of the train's impending arrival, carrying a valuable cargo that the Bones gang coveted. Clyde's jaw clenched as Frank handed him his monocular telescope, and he watched the gang from a hidden vantage point. The sight of Brian Carter fueled his burning desire for revenge, his heart heavy with memories of the day that had forever changed his life. The time for reckoning was drawing near. Frank, standing beside Clyde, studied the gang intently. His gaze narrowed, assessing their strengths and weaknesses. He knew that capturing Brian Carter and bringing down the Bones gang required precision and timing. Every move had to be calculated, every shot counted. "What you like at long range, kidda?" Frank said to Jed. I ain't got no experience at that, sir. I've only used a shotgun at close range," Rep. I.D. Jed after tying his horse to a nearby tree, then joining Frank and Clyde in the view. "Best stick to what you know. Here, take a look at the territory and get familiar with it," Frank said, handing the telescope to Jed. Jed keenly scanned the area, taking note. 5 horses tied there. They must have found someone to replace Doug. There could be more of them, but I think we're up against 5 men," said Clyde. As the sun dipped below the horizon, signaling the approach of dusk, the Bones gang made their final preparations. They mounted their horses and rode toward the designated spot where the train would soon pass. It was a treacherous section of track, nestled within the unforgiving embrace of Deadman's Pass. Clyde and Frank exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The time had come to intervene, to disrupt the gang's nefarious plans. Their fates were intertwined, bound by a shared purpose to bring justice to the lawless land they roamed. With quiet determination, Clyde, Frank and Jed began their descent into Deadman's Pass. The three of them left their horses tied loosely at the top. The rocky terrain challenged their every step, but their resolve remained unyielding. They moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on the train tracks that snaked through the canyon. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the stillness, accompanied by the distant whistle of the approaching train. Clyde and Frank quickened their pace, their hearts pounding in sync with the rhythmic chugging of the locomotive. A gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying with it a sense of anticipation. The stage was set for a clash between justice and lawlessness. A battle that would test the mettle of both Clyde and Frank. It was a duel that had been years in the making, a convergence of destinies that would shape their lives forever. The Bones gang got on their horses and slowly trod past the rock where Clyde, Frank, and Jed were hiding behind. Frank looked at Clyde with urgency. With a swift nod, Clyde and Frank descended from their hiding spot, their guns drawn and their senses honed. The deafening sound of gunfire filled the air as the bullets flew in all directions. They weaved through the pandemonium, each trying to take down gang members, but quickly decided to retreat behind the rock again when the gang started shooting. Harry let a shotgun blast at Jed and just missed him but caused some pain and damage to Jed's shoulder. Jed fell back behind the rock and he let out a cry of pain. Frank, from behind the rock, shot at Fred and hit him in his leg, forcing him to yell and curse. Amidst the chaos, Jed, his left shoulder throbbing with pain, mustered up the courage and determination to retaliate. Gritting his teeth, he aimed his revolver at Fred, who had shot him moments before. Fred, perched atop his galloping horse, brandished a sleek, silver-plated pistol with intricate engravings that gleamed in the sunlight. With a cold stare, he fired a shot, piercing Jed's flesh and causing him to wince in agony, but Jed's resilience overcame the pain. With a steady hand and a heart fueled by vengeance, he squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark, tearing through the air and striking Fred with a thunderous impact. A chilling scream pierced the chaotic atmosphere as Fred's body crumpled and disappeared in a cloud of dust. Amidst the turmoil, Brian's voice rose above the fray, his anger palpable. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice dripping with disbelief and fury. Harry, gripping his shotgun tightly, unleashed a barrage of shots towards Clyde and Frank, who sought refuge behind a large rock. Their pistols clenched tightly in their hands. The train was now approaching near and the Bones gang moved with urgency. The Bones gang's firepower was relentless, forcing Clyde, Frank, and Jed to hunker down, seeking cover from the onslaught. Frank, gritting his teeth in pain from a bullet lodged in his upper arm, reached for his trusty whiskey flask, taking a defiant sip to dull the ache. Jed, trembling but determined, struggled to reload his gun, his hands shaking with adrenaline. "I got one! I shot one of them dead!" Jed exclaimed, his voice a mix of triumph and fear. "Well done, kid," Frank acknowledged. "But I don't think we're gonna get the rest of these guys today." The gunfire momentarily ceased, and Brain's menacing voice cut through the tense air. "Who do you think you're messing with, boys? You're not getting out of here alive!" As the dust settled, the Bones gang, Brian, George, Reg, and Harry, sat astride their steeds, their figures ominously silhouetted against the railside. The approaching train rumbled closer, its wheels screeching against the tracks. George's voice carried a hint of uncertainty as he turned to Brian, asking, "Are we still going to do the job? They killed Fred, boss," said Reg in an urgent tone. "We got a train to catch," said George. Brian's anger and restlessness fueled his decision. "Okay, let's do this. We'll deal with these guys later," he declared, determination radiating from his every word. With a final warning cry, "You're dead men!" Brian spurred his horse forward, leading the Bones gang in a thunderous charge toward the approaching train, determined to seize their ill-gotten gains. The stage was set for a harrowing confrontation, the outcome of which would forever alter the lives of all involved. As the train rumbled closer, its iron behemoth imposing against the backdrop of the Wild West, the Bones gang rode alongside on their steeds, their horses galloping in synchrony with the train's thunderous momentum. The gang's presence was an intimidating sight, their figures bathed in the fiery glow of the setting sun. As the train slowed down, anticipation electrified the air. A security man, vigilant and armed with a shotgun, appeared at the door of one of the cars. He slid the door open, ready to protect the train and its precious cargo. However, before he could even react, Brian, fueled by a deadly combination of instinct and determination, swiftly aimed his revolver and pulled the trigger. The security man's lifeless body crumpled and fell out of the moving train, disappearing into the dust-laden abyss. Reg and Harry erupted into laughter, their joyous defiance echoing through the train cars. They quickly seized the opportunity, their horses skillfully maneuvering alongside the train. With deftness honed by countless heists, the gang members gracefully mounted the train, their boots landing firmly on the metal steps. Brian and George, the orchestrators of chaos, led the way, pistols clutched firmly in their hands. As they strode through the narrow aisles of the passenger cars, fear washed over the faces of the passengers. George, his voice laced with a chilling sense of control, called out to the trembling passengers. "Stay calm, ladies and gentlemen, and nobody gets hurt." The tense atmosphere inside the train was soon punctuated by the sounds of gunfire. At the section of the train where the bags of gold were kept, two brave security men stood their ground, determined to protect their cargo. Shots rang out, echoing through the confined space, as the guards valiantly defended their posts. The Bones gang, undeterred by resistance, returned fire with lethal accuracy. The cries of anguish mingled with the chaotic symphony of gunfire as the gang members overpowered the guards. One by one, the security men fell, their lives extinguished in a whirlwind of violence. With the path cleared, the gang swiftly grabbed the bags of gold, their weight signifying the rewards of their audacious endeavor. Without hesitation, they hurled the bags out of the train, the golden treasures hurtling through the air and landing with a resounding thud on the dusty ground below. As the train sped along the tracks, the Bones gang members, their faces etched with triumph and adrenaline, leaped from the moving vehicle, their bodies seamlessly merging with the rugged terrain. The gang gathered, their eyes gleaming with the spoils of their daring escapade, as they surveyed the scene before them. Brian, his voice filled with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation, addressed his comrades. "We did it, boys! We got what we came for. Now let's make our escape and count our fortune. We'll deal with anyone who tries to stand in our way." The gang shared a moment of raucous laughter, their camaraderie solidified by their shared triumph. They mounted their horses, the wind whispering through the desert, carrying their echoes of rebellion and avarice into the vast expanse. With the stolen gold in their possession, they rode off into the fading twilight, leaving behind a trail of chaos and shattered lives. Meanwhile, Clyde's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled a bullet from Frank's upper arm. Then, pressing on his wound, Frank asked Jed to tear his shirt for some material to bandage with. Jed took his shirt off, and with a knife he tore a length of material and gave it to Frank. Frank wrapped the bandage around Frank's upper arm, then tended to Jed's wound. "Arg!" screamed Jed as Frank pulled the bullets from his shoulder. Jed took a drink of whiskey from Frank's flask. "We can't take them on with you two being wounded," said Clyde as he sat down. "I can still fight," said Jed, standing up. Clyde then looked at Frank. "It's my left shoulder, I can still shoot," said Frank with a look of determination. "So what do we do? Do we chase after them?" "Get our horses first," said Jed. Clyde was lost in thought, then quickly snapped out of it. "Okay, let's get the horses." The three of them headed back up to where they tied their horses. After a short climb, the three men mounted their horses and speedily headed down toward the railway's line, in pursuit of the Bones gang, who could not be far ahead. A short while after crossing the railway line, Clyde could see the Bones gang ahead. "Come on, we can catch up, they're carrying a lot of loot, and it will slow them down," said Clyde. Jed smiled, looking a bit excited about the forthcoming battle. The three of them speedily galloped ahead, catching up to the Bones gang. Harry spotted the three men in pursuit and slowed down to turn his horse round and aim his shotgun. "So you want to play, boys?" shouted Harry, then shot this shotgun toward Clyde but missed, hitting Jed's horse instead. The horse let out a shriek of pain as it tumbled to the ground, and Jed fell off the horse onto his injured shoulder. His gun fell out of his hand as he yelled, "God damn! Ah!" Jed wriggled on the floor in agony, mumbling, "Get after them, I'll be all right." Jed crawled to get his gun. Meanwhile, Harry was reloading his shotgun. "Get ready to meet your maker," he growled. Frank shot Harry with precision in his forehead, then again in his shoulder. Harry fell back off the horse with a wailing groan and died in an instant. Jed was getting back on his feet while Clyde and Frank galloped ahead on their horses. It took him a while to get to his feet, then he walked behind them as fast as he could, pushing through his pain. The rest of Bones' gang managed to get quite a distance away while Harry was shooting, but Clyde and Frank soon caught up. With a surge of determination, Clyde closed the distance between them, his finger tightening around the trigger. A single gunshot echoed through the canyon, marking the culmination of years of pain and longing. As Clyde and Frank closed in on the Bones gang, the tension in the air grew palpable. The pursuit had intensified, and victory seemed within their grasp. But fate had a different plan in store. Just as they were about to catch up, the rugged terrain shifted abruptly, revealing a treacherous ravine carved by a recent downpour. The force of the floodwaters transformed the creek into a formidable obstacle, separating Clyde, Frank, and Jed from the escaping gang. Wide-eyed and filled with frustration, Clyde and Frank watched in disbelief as the Bones gang approached a precarious rope bridge up ahead. With the loot clutched tightly in their hands, the gang took a daring leap of faith, racing across the swaying bridge. Clyde and Frank were left stranded at the edge of the ravine, their pursuit thwarted by the unrelenting currents. The bridge, unable to withstand the raging waters, collapsed with a deafening crash, severing any hope of immediate confrontation. Grim determination etched on their faces, Clyde, Frank, and Jed contemplated their next move. They knew they had to find an alternative route to continue the chase, but the ravine stood as an imposing barrier, mocking their efforts. In the fading light, as the waters raged below, Clyde clenched his fists, vowing to overcome this unexpected setback. The Bones gang had slipped through their fingers, but the pursuit was far from over. With renewed resolve, Clyde and his companions set their sights on finding a way across, determined to bring the outlaws to justice. Chapter 6. The Tempest Rises. Dark clouds loomed overhead as Clyde, Frank, and Jed rode through the relentless thunderstorm. Rain cascaded down upon them, drenching their clothes and horses, turning the dirt track into a muddy quagmire. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the rugged landscape with its brilliant flashes. The storm seemed to mirror the turmoil within Clyde's heart. The encounter with the Bones gang had slipped through their grasp, leaving him with a burning determination to bring them to justice. Frank, ever stoic, kept his eyes focused ahead, his unwavering resolve matched only by the thunder's resounding roar. As they pressed on, the sound of galloping hooves approached from behind. Through the rain-soaked curtain, Jed emerged, his face etched with determination and soaked to the bone. He pulled alongside Clyde and Frank, a triumphant smile breaking through the storm's fury. "Harry shot my horse dead, but I managed to take his," Jed shouted above the roaring thunder. "We ain't losing ground, boys. I'm back in the chase." Clyde and Frank exchanged nods of gratitude, relieved that their relentless pursuit could continue unhindered. With Jed mounted on Harry's horse, their determination surged, driving them forward with renewed energy. Navigating through the treacherous conditions, they urged their horses on, their hooves splashing through puddles and sinking into the muddy terrain. The relentless rain obscured their vision, and the thunder drowned out their thoughts. But their mission remained clear: to track down the Bones gang and put an end to their reign of terror. Amidst the chaos of the storm, their bond grew stronger. They had become a cohesive unit, each member relying on the others to weather the storm both literally and metaphorically. Together, they defied the elements, pressing forward with unwavering determination. The thunderstorms served as a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the Wild West, a harsh and relentless landscape that tested the limits of one's willpower. With each flash of lightning, Clyde's resolve grew stronger, fueled by the memories of his shattered past and the burning desire for justice. As the tempest raged on, Clyde, Frank, and Jed rode forth, undeterred by the elements. They knew that within the storm's tumultuous embrace lay the key to unraveling the dark secrets that bound the Bones gang. With every thunderclap, their determination surged, propelling them further into the heart of the storm and closer to their ultimate confrontation. Lightning cracked with a thunderous fury, as the storm raged both within and around our heroes. Little did they know that within the tempest lay the answers they sought, and the reckoning they yearned for awaited just beyond the storm clouds. And with Jed's arrival on Harry's horse, their pursuit gained new momentum, driving them forward with an unyielding resolve. The storm eventually settled, leaving behind a calmness that belied the intensity of the pursuit. Clyde, Frank, and Jed rode side by side, their steeds slowing their pace as they approached a tight bend in the road. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of their mission palpable. Clyde cast a glance at Frank, his eyes reflecting the shared understanding between them. They had come too far to let anything or anyone stand in their way. Jed, ever loyal and ready for action, remained by their side, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. As they rounded the bend, a small town emerged on the horizon. The wooden structures and dusty streets hinted at a life untouched by the lawlessness that plagued the Wild West. Yet, beneath the surface, they knew danger lurked. A sign next to the first house said "Welcome to Willow Springs." 4 horsemen turned the corner at the other end of town and began moving toward Clyde, Frank, and Jed. As they got closer, they slowed down, and one member said, "We got strangers in town. What brings you here, boys?" Clyde, Frank, and Jed slowed down as the 4 men on horses got a lot closer and stopped facing them. A sudden shout shattered the silence, piercing through the air. "Frank? Is that you?" A figure emerged from the shadows, mounted on a powerful steed. It was Joe Reynolds, the notorious leader of the Black Hand gang. His rugged features and scarred face were a testament to a life of violence. Recognition flickered across Frank's face as he stared at Joe, his old acquaintance turned rival. The tension grew thicker, and the weight of their shared history hung heavily in the air. "Joe Reynolds," Frank said, his voice steady and resolute. "Didn't think I'd ever cross paths with you again." Joe dismounted, his eyes locked onto Frank's. Well, the baddest gunslinger in the West," he sneered. "I heard the stories, but I thought they were just tales spun by the wind. Looks like they're true after all." The rest of Joe's gang members, Jake, Hank, and Pete, stood back, their presence adding to the tense atmosphere. Joe held up his hand, signaling them to stay put. This was a duel between legends, and he wanted to face Frank alone. "Whatever happens, you don't get involved, okay? This is a duel, got it?" said Joe to his gang. "But Joe," Pete said and was going to continue, but Joe interrupted. "A duel. You lot stay out of this, the winner walks away," said Joe. Clyde and Jed exchanged glances, their instincts telling them to step back, allowing the standoff to play out. They dismounted and moved a safe distance away, their eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before them. The town seemed to hold its breath as Frank and Joe stood facing each other, the weight of their reputations hanging heavily in the balance. The sun cast long shadows on the deserted streets, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of the moment. "You always had a knack for finding trouble, Joe," Frank said, his voice steady and calm. "But this time, it's going to end differently." A hush fell over the town, the silence broken only by the creaking of a nearby sign swinging in the wind. The tension built with each passing moment, both men locked in a duel of wills, waiting for the other to make the first move. As the seconds stretched into eternity, the anticipation reached its zenith. The eyes of the onlookers, the members of both gangs, and even the townsfolk who had emerged from their hiding places were fixated on the 2 gunslingers. The scene was a tableau frozen in time, a clash of legends on the precipice of conflict. The air crackled with electricity, as if the very fabric of the town held its breath, waiting for the eruption that was about to ensue. With the tension reaching its breaking point, Frank and Joe stared into each other's eyes, the weight of their past transgressions and grudges fueling their determination. The world narrowed down to the two men, their gunslinger instincts honed and their nerves taut. The stage was set for a showdown, a clash of titans that would leave an indelible mark on the wild landscape. The townsfolk watched with bated breath, knowing that once the first shot rang out, there would be no turning back. As Frank and Joe stood at the precipice of destiny, the wind whispered its secrets through the dusty streets. The atmosphere crackled with the energy of anticipation, the momentary lull before the storm of gunfire and fate. Joe's hand twitched toward his holster, his eyes narrowing with determination. "You always were quick on the draw, Frank," he remarked, a hint of admiration mixed with animosity. "But today, I'm gonna show you what it means to face a real gunslinger." Frank's gaze remained locked on Joe, his hand hovering over his own well-worn revolver. He knew that this duel would be more than a test of marksmanship. It would be a battle of survival, a clash of wills, and a settling of scores. The onlookers held their breath, their hearts pounding in unison. It was as if time had slowed down, the world reduced to the space between these two adversaries. They were on the edge of an abyss, and only one would emerge unscathed. The tension reached its zenith, the air heavy with the weight of their histories, their pride, and the lives they had taken. In this moment, all past grievances, alliances, and loyalties faded away, leaving only the cold reality of the impending duel. A bead of sweat trickled down Frank's brow as he steadied his grip on the handle of his Colt. The intensity of the situation etched lines of determination on his face, his eyes a steely reflection of his resolve. Joe's fingers twitched with anticipation, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance to prove himself, to claim his own place in the annals of the Wild West. The echoes of his past deeds reverberated in his mind, fueling his thirst for victory. A moment of stillness enveloped the town, as if the very essence of life had paused to witness this fateful encounter. The wind whispered through the deserted streets, carrying with it the weight of countless stories and the spirits of those who had fallen. Then, with lightning speed, Frank and Joe drew their pistols, the metallic clang of their hammers cocking echoing through the air. Time seemed to stretch as their eyes met one final time, a silent acknowledgement of the lives intertwined and the choices that had led them to this moment. The thunderous roar of gunfire shattered the silence, the reports echoing through the town like a symphony of destruction. The two gunslingers danced through the bullets, their movements a deadly ballet, each shot an expression of their skill and desperation. The townsfolk cowered behind closed doors and shuttered windows, their hearts pounding in their chests. Dust and smoke filled the air, creating an ethereal haze that obscured the outcome of the duel. As the gun smoke cleared, it revealed a scene of both triumph and tragedy. The two gunslingers stood, their gazes locked, wounds staining their clothes and bodies. Each had paid a heavy price in this dance of death, their determination etched deep in their souls. Staring at each other in disbelief, both men slumped to the ground and quickly died. Clyde and Jed were frozen in disbelief and shock at the outcome, and Jed let out a gasp. As the smoke cleared, the figures of Frank and Joe lay motionless on the ground. Their bodies, once symbols of power and infamy, now laid still, the weight of their pasts forever etched upon them. The rain continued to fall, mourning their demise, washing away the final remnants of their existence. Clyde and Jed, witnesses to the tragic duel, approached the fallen gunslingers with heavy hearts. There was no glory in this moment, only a somber acknowledgement of lives lost and a realization of the fragile nature of their own existence. Jed knelt beside Frank's lifeless form, a mixture of sadness and respect in his eyes. "He was a legend, Clyde," Jed said, his voice filled with a melancholic tone. "A true gunslinger, one of the last of his kind. We've lost something important today." Clyde, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and determination, replied, "You're right, Jed. They knew that Frank's death would not be in vain. His sacrifice would fuel their pursuit of the Bones Gang and their mission to bring them to justice." The loss of their friend only strengthened their resolve, pushing them to fight harder, to endure the hardships that lay ahead. The rest of the gang members, Jake, Hank, and Pete, in shock clumsily got back on their horses. Hank was mad and got his gun out. Clyde and Jed backed away from Frank's body to get behind a building. "No! No, Hank!" shouted Jake. "Joe wanted us to stay out of it. Put the gun away." Hank staggered around on his horse and looked at Jake furiously while he pointed his gun toward Clyde and Jed. "What?" he said to Jake. "Leave it, Hank," said Jake. Hank snarled but then put his gun down and then back in his. Hollister then shouted over at Clyde and Jed. "You guys had better ride on straight out of town. You hear me?" Clyde and Jed got back on their horses and slowly moved through town and past Jake, Hank, and Pete, who gave them an evil stare. The standoff had ended, but the echoes of the duel lingered in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The fate of the town, and the lives of its inhabitants, hung in the balance, as the Wild West continued its relentless march toward an uncertain future. Hank spat on the ground and Alsmith growled at the two men as they passed. When Clyde and Jed were knurled through the town, Hank got this gun out and shot a single shot into the air to scare them. "You wanna hope you never see me again!" yelled Hank. Clyde and Jed, on their horses, began to gallop away from the town, forever altered by the loss of Frank and their encounter with the Black Hand gang. As they stood on the precipice of destiny, they knew that their journey was far from over. The path ahead was treacherous and filled with perils yet to be faced. Leaving the town and the fallen gunslingers behind, Clyde and Jed ventured back onto the trodden path. The storm had settled, and the landscape lay before them, a vast expanse of rugged beauty and untamed wilderness. The setting sun cast a warm golden light upon the land, as if nature itself whispered words of encouragement and solace. They rode in silence, their horses treading along the worn trail. The landscape stretched out before them, a tapestry of rolling hills, majestic mesas, and distant mountains. The beauty of the West stood in stark contrast to the violence and chaos that often consumed its inhabitants. Jed, ever the philosopher, broke the silence with a contemplative voice. "Clyde, it's moments like these that make me ponder the state of our country. The West, once a land of opportunity and freedom, is being tamed and shackled. The forces of progress and civilization are sweeping across the land, leaving little room for the likes of us." Clyde listened intently, appreciating Jed's insightful words. He had always admired Jed's ability to see beyond the surface, to grasp the deeper truths that lay beneath. The landscape around them seemed to mirror Jed's sentiment, a vast expanse of untamed beauty, both fragile and resilient. "Jed, you speak words of wisdom," Clyde said, a tinge of sadness in his voice. "But perhaps, in the face of progress, it is our duty to preserve the spirit of the West. To fight for justice." Jed nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're right, Clyde. It's better we fight against people like the Bones Gang, to stop them terrorizing others along the way, than nothing at all." As they rode along the trodden path, the landscape transformed before them. Rolling plains gave way to rocky canyons, and the distant mountains grew closer with each passing mile. The sun began its descent, casting a warm glow over the land, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Clyde couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and admiration for the vastness and untamed beauty of the West. It was a land of contradictions, where danger and opportunity coexisted, and where the echoes of the past mingled with the whispers of the future. The trodden path led them to a small encampment nestled between two rocky outcroppings. It was a temporary respite, a chance to rest and gather their strength before the next leg of their journey. They dismounted, tethered their horses, and settled around a crackling campfire. Jed, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, continued the thread of their earlier conversation. "Clyde, the West may be changing, but the fight for justice remains constant. Our pursuit of the Bones Gang is not just about vengeance, it's about ensuring that the innocent can carve out a life free from fear and oppression." Clyde nodded, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "You're right, Jed. It's our duty to carry on Frank's legacy, to bring the Bones Gang to justice." The crackling of the fire seemed to echo their shared resolve, casting dancing shadows upon their faces. In the distance, the cry of a lone coyote pierced the night, a reminder of the untamed spirit that still lingered in the west. As they settled into a somber silence, Clyde and Jed found solace in each other's presence. They were united by a common purpose, bound by the memories of their fallen friend, and fueled by the desire to make a difference in a changing world. The night sky spread its blanket of stars above them, each shimmering light a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the countless stories yet to be told. Clyde leaned back, his gaze fixed on the celestial canopy, and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. "Jed," Clyde spoke softly, his voice carrying a sense of determination. "We may be just two men in a vast and changing world, but I believe that together we can make a difference." Jed looked at Clyde, a spark of admiration in his eyes. "Aye, Clyde, we may not change the course of the West, but we can leave our mark upon it." And so, beneath the starlit sky, Clyde and Jed made a silent pact, their hearts filled with purpose and their spirits unyielding. The West beckoned them, its untamed beauty intertwined with its dark secrets, and they rode on, destined to face their dangerous task that lay ahead. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, Clyde and Jed emerged from their campsite. Their horses, refreshed and eager, stood at the ready. The surrounding landscape unfolded before them, a breathtaking tapestry of rolling hills, jagged cliffs, and vast open plains. Mounting their steeds, Clyde and Jed embarked on their continued pursuit of the Bones gang. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats resonated through the air as they rode, their horses seamlessly navigating the trodden path. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the promise of a new day and the weight of their mission. The landscape stretched out before them, an expansive canvas that seemed to merge seamlessly with the infinite sky. Majestic mesas towered in the distance, their rugged faces etched by the passage of time. Patches of wildflowers adorned the plains, painting vibrant strokes of color across the muted earth tones. As they rode, Clyde's gaze occasionally drifted to Jed, his companion and confidant. He admired Jed's resilience and unwavering dedication to their cause. Jed, in turn, remained steadfast, his eyes scanning the horizon with a mix of determination and caution. Their conversation had dwindled to a comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between them filling the void. Each passing mile only fueled their resolve, their shared mission binding them together like the woven threads of a tapestry. Meanwhile, at the Bones gang's hideout, a sense of both triumph and loss filled the air. The remaining members, Brian, George, and Reg, dismounted from their horses, weariness etched across their faces. The bags of stolen gold, heavy with their ill-gotten gains, were placed on a weathered wooden table. Brian's voice broke the silence. "Well, boys, we did it. We got the loot, but at a cost. Harry and Doug, they didn't make it." George's gaze hardened, his jaw set in determination. "Those bounty hunters, Clyde and Jed, they'll pay for what they've done. We'll find them, and we'll make sure they meet their end." Reg nodded in agreement, his eyes flickering with a mix of vengeance and sorrow. "Harry and Doug were good men. We owe it to them to avenge their deaths." The room fell silent once more, the gravity of their words hanging heavily in the air. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the faces of the Bones gang, their features reflecting a mix of determination, loss, and the unquenchable thirst for revenge. Outside, the sun began its ascent, casting a golden glow upon the hideout. The wind rustled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it the weight of the gang's intentions. As they strategized their next move, the echoes of their fallen comrades reverberated in their hearts, a reminder of the cost of their chosen path. With the promise of a new day, Clyde and Jed rode onward, their pursuit unyielding. The vast landscape stretched out before them, an ever-changing tableau that bore witness to their journey. Their horses, galloping in unison, carried them further into the depths of the untamed West, each hoofbeat a testament to their unwavering resolve. In the distance, the Bones gang prepared to face their own reckoning, their hearts filled with determination and the thirst for revenge. The clash between these forces was inevitable, their fates intertwined in the vast expanse of the Wild West. Only time would reveal the outcome, as the sun continued its celestial dance and the journey towards justice and redemption forged ahead. unquenchable thirst for revenge. Outside, the sun began its ascent, casting a golden glow upon the hideout. The wind rustled through the surrounding trees, carrying with it the weight of the gang's intentions. As they strategized their next move, the echoes of their fallen comrades reverberated in their hearts, a reminder of the cost of their chosen path. With the promise of a new day, Clyde and Jed rode onward, their pursuit unyielding. The vast landscape stretched out before them, an ever-changing tableau that bore witness to their journey. Their horses, galloping in unison, carried them further into the depths of the untamed West, each hoofbeat a testament to their unwavering resolve. In the distance, the Bones gang prepared to face their own reckoning, their hearts filled with determination and the thirst for revenge. The clash between these forces was inevitable, their fates intertwined in the vast expanse of the Wild West. Only time would reveal the outcome, as the sun continued its celestial dance and the journey towards justice and redemption forged ahead. Chapter 7. Bad Day at Cedar Ridge. Clyde and Jed ventured into the small town of Cedar Ridge after a long and arduous journey through the rugged countryside. Their horses, weary from the miles traveled, trotted into town with a slow and steady pace. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the anticipation of their arrival. As they dismounted in front of the local saloon, the doors swung open with a creak, revealing the dimly lit interior. The wooden walls were adorned with weathered wanted posters and the echoes of rowdy laughter lingered in the air. The townsfolk paused their conversations and turned their gaze toward the newcomers. Reg, a member of the notorious Bones gang, leaned casually on the bar, a sadistic smile stretching across his face. His eyes narrowed as he focused on Clyde and Jed, recognizing them as the bounty hunters from Dusty Creek. "Well, look who we got here, if it isn't our bounty hunters from Dusty Creek," Reg sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. His companion, standing beside him, looked on with a glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. Reg pointed at a large bottle of bourbon on the shelf, signaling the barman. "Give me a double of that," he demanded, placing 2 gleaming pieces of gold on the bar. The barman's eyes widened at the sight of the precious coins, his face mirroring a mix of surprise and greed. Without missing a beat, the barman quickly cleaned a glass and poured a generous measure of whiskey. Clyde raised the glass to his lips, savoring the fiery liquid before placing the empty tumbler back on the worn bar, its surface scarred by countless glasses before it. Jed stood behind Clyde, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. His eyes darted nervously between Reg and his companion, eager to assess the situation. Reg removed his hat, placing it carefully on the bar, and then picked up his glass of bourbon, downing it in one swift motion. The saloon fell momentarily silent, interrupted only by the sound of Reg licking his lips and wiping his face with his left hand. With a sense of menace, he turned back to Clyde and Jed. "Just 2 of you now? What happened to old Frank?" he taunted, taking a seat on a nearby stool. Jed took a sip of his drink, attempting to mask his nerves. "Frank got killed in a duel, back in that little town on the corner," he replied, his voice tinged with a mixture of grief and determination. Reg leaned in closer to his companion, engaging in a whispered conversation. Clyde watched the exchange, his gaze fixed on Reg's calculating eyes. Moments later, Reg's companion whispered a request, expressing a desire for a duel with Clyde. Reg frowned and replied in hushed tones, "No, he's real fast. You'll be beat. I'll duel with him. Let's see if his friend will accept the challenge." A flicker of determination sparked in Jed's eyes as he looked to Clyde, eager to prove himself. "If you think you can handle it," he challenged, his voice resonating with youthful bravado. Clyde placed a firm hand on Jed's shoulder, a silent warning that spoke volumes. "No, Jed! I can't let this happen. I won't be left with it on my conscience," he declared with unwavering resolve. Jed's fiery spirit began to subside, realizing the weight of the situation. He reluctantly accepted Clyde's guidance, understanding the potential consequences of a duel gone wrong. Though the desire to duel burned within him, he chose to trust in Clyde's wisdom. "I'll duel with him," Clyde announced, meeting Reg's gaze head-on, his eyes ablaze with determination. Reg erupted into a joyous laugh, ordering another drink to celebrate the impending duel. "Excellent! This should be fun!" he exclaimed, taking a swig from his freshly poured drink. Curiosity piqued, Clyde sought to learn his opponent's name. "What's your friend's name? I want to know who I'm dueling with," he inquired, his voice steady and measured. "Torch. He used to be with Hank and Joe's gang, but he's been with the Bones gang for a few weeks now. He's one of us," Reg replied, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he affectionately rubbed Torch's shoulder. As the tension simmered in the saloon, Clyde and Jed prepared themselves for the imminent clash with the Bones gang. The stage was set for a showdown that would test their mettle and shape the fate of Cedar Ridge. "Well, Torch, have you ever been in a duel shootout before? Ever been in a shootout?" Clyde asked, his voice laced with a hint of curiosity and challenge. Torch seemed visibly agitated and insulted by the questions. He shuffled his feet forward and sneered. "Enjoy your last drink, bounty hunter." His voice carried a venomous edge, leaving no doubt about his intentions. Reg, taken aback for a moment, broke the silence with a burst of laughter. "Ha ha! Last drink? I like it, funny Torch!" he chuckled, finding amusement in the situation. Torch, however, remained unamused. He picked up his glass and guzzled down his whiskey in a show of defiance. Clyde finished his drink, his eyes focused on Reg and Torch. With a calm and collected demeanor, he addressed Reg. "You know, Torch has probably killed more men than you two bounty hunters put together, isn't that right, Torch?" Clyde's words held a touch of skepticism, testing the waters of Torch's reputation. Torch's gaze turned dark and menacing as he locked eyes with Clyde and Jed, the weight of his past deeds evident in his glare. "It's a duel, fair and square. No one gets involved, right?" Clyde emphasized, seeking confirmation and a commitment to honor the code of dueling. Reg nodded, a sly grin on his face. "You have my word. No one gets involved. May the best man win," he affirmed, a mischievous spark in his eyes. Clyde couldn't help but feel a tinge of unease at the unsettling laughter that escaped Reg's lips, momentarily unsettling both Clyde and Jed. Stepping away from the bar, Clyde tipped his hat toward Reg and Torch, signaling the commencement of the duel. "What do you say we go outside and settle this like gentlemen?" he proposed, his voice steady and resolute. Reg and Torch rose from their stools and made their way to the saloon's exit doors, their every movement resonating with purpose. The doors creaked as they swung open, revealing the dusty expanse that lay beyond. Clyde and Jed followed closely behind, the weight of the impending showdown resting on their shoulders. Concern etched across Jed's face as he looked at Clyde. "Don't worry, kid. Whatever happens, you just keep going, okay?" Clyde assured him, his voice carrying a mix of caution and reassurance. Jed's eyes bore into Clyde's, a determined fire igniting within him. "Clyde, you're gonna win. We're gonna finish this afterward." Jed's voice trailed off, a firm determination echoing in his words. Don't go soft on me. Clyde's expression softened momentarily, acknowledging Jed's unwavering faith. Ah, what a beautiful sunset. This sets the scene just right, doesn't it, Torch? Reg remarked, his voice tinged with an unsettling delight as the four of them stood outside the saloon, the vast expanse of the clearing stretching before them. You're going to stay out of this, Reg? I'm not dueling with you beside him, Clyde asserted, his voice holding an air of authority. Of course, of course. I'll be right over there, out of the way, Reg replied, pointing at two nearby buildings as if marking his territory. Clyde sensed a shared understanding between foes, an unspoken agreement to honor the rules and integrity of a duel. Even Reg, in his own way, recognized the significance of this solemn moment. Reg slowly walked away, leaving Torch standing alone in the middle of the clearing. Clyde took a few steps back, positioning himself at the opposite end. Jed found his place on the wooden platform just outside the saloon, where curious onlookers poked their heads out of doors and windows to witness the impending duel. Silence settled upon the small town as the two men stood facing each other, framed by the vibrant hues of the setting sun. Torch's silhouette cast an imposing shadow, his hand hovering near his open holster. Clyde squinted his eyes, his focus razor-sharp, searching for any slight movement or gesture. When you're ready, Torch taunted, his voice dripping with scorn. Maybe you haven't got the guts? He added, spitting on the ground with contempt. A bird soared through the sky, its dark form crossing behind Torch's shadow, disappearing into the fiery embrace of the sunset. In that fleeting moment, Torch swiftly drew his gun, aiming it at Clyde. But Clyde's reflexes were quicker than lightning as he unleashed a bullet that found its mark, striking Torch in the chest. The force of the impact sent Torch stumbling backward, his gun slipping from his grasp. "Arf!" Torch cried out, collapsing onto the dusty ground. Clyde approached, his footsteps purposeful, and delivered a final shot to swiftly end Torch's suffering. Their eyes met briefly, Torch's gaze a silent plea for release. In an act of respect, Clyde retrieved Torch's fallen gun and returned it to its holster. He then placed Torch's hat back on his lifeless head, a symbolic gesture of closure. "You were quick, I'll give you that," Clyde murmured softly, paying tribute to his fallen opponent. With a solemn stride, he walked back to the saloon to join Jed, who greeted him with a smile of relief. "I knew it! I knew you would beat him!" Jed exclaimed, his voice brimming with admiration and satisfaction. Reg approached Clyde and Jed, his voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Okay, you think you're gonna take out the rest of the Bones gang, do you?" he asked, rubbing his chin as he drew closer to Clyde. With swift determination, Clyde pulled out his gun, pointing it directly at Reg. The tension in the air was palpable as the two men locked eyes. "You're next on the list," Clyde declared firmly, his weapon poised about 10 feet away. From Reg took a step back, his expression betraying a mixture of apprehension and defiance. "But not tonight. We'll honor the duel, remember? Whatever happens, we'll settle this another day," he stated, retreating into the distance. Clyde holstered his gun, momentarily lowering his guard. But before he could fully relax, Reg pulled out his gun from a distance, catching everyone off guard. A cry of pain escaped Jed's lips as Reg shot him in the leg. Reacting swiftly, Clyde drew his gun and fired at Reg, who managed to find cover behind the side of a nearby building. Reg's voice carried a vengeful warning as he shouted, "I'll be back! Gonna get you, damn you!" before disappearing into the distance. Clyde rushed to Jed's side, providing him with immediate medical attention and securing a room for him in a nearby hotel inn. Jed would need time to recover from his injury. As night fell, Clyde kept a vigilant watch for any signs of the Bones gang in town, inquiring with the locals for any information. Unfortunately, his efforts yielded no valuable leads. Later that night, Clyde returned to the hotel inn and sat beside Jed's bed. Just rest tonight, kid. We've got plenty of time to catch up, he advised, his voice gentle and reassuring. Sure, but we get back on the trail tomorrow, right? Jed inquired, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. Clyde nodded as he settled into a chair next to the bed, reaching over to dim the oil lamp. Good night, kidda, he bid Jed, the weariness of their journey evident in his voice. Good night, Clyde, Jed responded, finding comfort in the presence of his loyal companion. It didn't take long for Jed to succumb to exhaustion, drifting into a peaceful slumber. Elsewhere, Reg arrived at one of the Bones gang's nearby hideouts, panic etched into his voice. Boss, they killed Torch and Harry. They're coming for the rest of us, he exclaimed, his words filled with a sense of urgency. George, the gang's leader, maintained a calm composure as he addressed Reg's distress. Pull yourself together, Reg. What has happened? He asked, his voice steady and commanding. Those bounty hunters. Harry had a shootout in the town square, and the bounty hunter killed him. They're sharpshooters, boss. He's real quick on the draw, Reg explained, his anxiety manifesting as beads of sweat formed on his brow. Brian, George's brother, observed Reg in silence, his mind contemplating the trustworthiness of their new member. Reg had ingratiated himself with Fred and Doug, but now that they were gone, doubts lingered. George shifted his gaze to Brian, a sense of resignation on his face as he realized the thoughts running through his brother's mind. Without a word, Brian raised his gun, swiftly and coldly delivering a fatal shot to Reg's forehead. The lifeless body crumpled to the floor, the echoes of the gunshot lingering in the hideout. George turned away from Brian, his expression solemn as he settled back into his chair. Silence filled the space as they both contemplated the harsh reality they faced. It's just down to us two again, brother, Brian acknowledged, his voice tinged with a mix of determination and resignation. George's gaze shifted into the distance, his mind lost in contemplation and hidden emotions. Do you remember when we used to talk about building a ranch in Cedar Ridge? We can do that now. We'll gather what we need from. Brian's optimism began to fill the room. George's distant gaze remained fixed, his thoughts elsewhere, detached from the present moment. Brian playfully flicked the pieces of gold in one of the bags, reveling in their newfound wealth. It's so nice to look at. And all ours. He laughed, his tone carrying a mix of satisfaction and greed. You know, we don't need to think too much about those bounty hunters, George. We can handle them. It's not a problem, Brian declared, his confidence shining through, masking the underlying uncertainties that lurked beneath the surface. We need to get out of here, George insisted, his voice filled with urgency. What? We've only just arrived. Haven't even finished counting the loot. There's so much of it, ha ha. Brian chuckled, his laughter echoing through the hideout. Are all these riches worth risking our lives? George questioned, his tone laced with concern. Sitting on a chair, clad in jeans and a jacket, Brian looked puzzled as he sighed and glanced at his brother. What's wrong with you? We pulled off the job, got the loot. If you're worried about those bounty hunters. Brian paused, awaiting George's response. Yes. It's those damn bounty hunters I'm worried about, George exclaimed abruptly. Brian fixed his gaze on George, his eyes showing that he was genuinely listening. They've already killed all our men, Brian, except Reg. But we might have bitten off more than we can chew here. How are we going to move all this loot? The two of us can't carry it all the way, George explained, his concern apparent. I know that. We'll hide some of it down this end and come back for it, Brian replied enthusiastically, rising from his seat. I've already got a plan. There's a shack over there. We'll bury 2 of these bags underneath it and return when we need them. Okay, but what if someone finds them? George voiced his worries. Brian looked puzzled at George's apprehension. No one's going to find them, Besides, we won't be away for that long. We'll come back soon enough, Brian assured, grabbing a shovel and gesturing for George to follow. Come on. Brian dug a hole behind the shack, and together, they carefully placed 2 bags of loot from the train robbery into the pit. Brian skillfully covered the hole, ensuring that the disturbed ground was undetectable. Smiling, Brian placed a firm hand on his brother's shoulder. See? No problem. We'll return here in a couple of days to retrieve these, okay? He reassured. Okay, George replied, accepting Brian's plan. But let's not stick around in case those bounty hunters are on their way. I say we head out now, he proposed. All right, if that's what you think, George. We can set off now, Brian agreed, and they gathered the remaining loot before mounting their horses. I'm almost out of bullets. We need some breathing space for a while. That's why I don't want to stick around, George explained as he climbed onto his horse. Brian, still securing his loot to the back of his saddle, replied, I've got plenty of bullets, George. Why didn't you say something? I could have given you some. He then mounted his own horse. There's more to it than that, isn't there, George? You're scared, Brian observed as he nudged his horse forward. George met Brian's gaze, his expression confirming his fear. Yes, he was scared. We can handle these boys. Don't worry about it. We've come through everything else, haven't we? Brian offered words of reassurance as they began their journey away from the hideout, heading north. The following morning, back in town, Jed was back on his feet, standing proudly. I'm ready. I can go now, Clyde, he announced, eager to get back on track. Clyde looked at Jed, a mix of concern and relief in his eyes. Doesn't it hurt? He inquired. Well, yes, it hurts a bit, but I can manage. I can move around just fine, Jed responded, demonstrating his walking abilities with determination. Okay, well, there's no hurry to get moving if you need to rest, Clyde said as he settled himself down, taking a seat. I'm ready. The longer we wait, the further the Bones gang will get away, Jed declared, walking over to grab his coat and gun belt. Emily, the nurse, offered her concern. You should rest for today, really. But Jed was determined to get going, urging. Clyde. Thank you, Emily, but we got work to do. Come on, Clyde. Reluctantly, Clyde rose to his feet and made his way towards the door. Thank you for your help, miss. Here's a little thank you, Clyde said, handing the young woman a coin. Oh, thank you, kind sir, replied Emily, her face beaming with gratitude. Clyde and Jed walked out of the hotel building, making their way over to where their horses were waiting. As they approached, Clyde's gaze caught sight of a wanted poster on the wall of the post office building. It displayed a familiar face, Hank Allison, a member of the gang that Joe once belonged to. The reward offered was a staggering $20,000. $20,000! Clyde exclaimed, contemplating the opportunity. I might have to take that one up, he muttered to himself. Jed coughed beside him, drawing his attention. We've got to get the rest of the Bones gang first, Jed reminded him. Clyde turned to face Jed, considering his words. Yeah, I guess so. But that might only take us 2 or 3 days. I've got a future to think about. We'll split the money between us, kid. If you're clever, it could set you up for the rest of your life, Clyde suggested, a hint of ambition in his voice. Jed smiled, his eyes filled with determination. It's not about the money, Clyde. Not for me, anyway. I just want these guys off the face of the earth. He spat his hate onto the ground. Me too, kiddo. But we've got to think about the money as well and what we're going to do after all this, Clyde said, his gaze fixed on Jed, awaiting his response. Well, I'm just going to go back home after all this. Maybe buy a few things to improve our place, take Alice somewhere nice for a break. I don't know, I haven't thought about it much, Jed shared, lost in thought. You know, I never thought about after either. I just want to stop these guys. The things they've done. They should be brought to justice. Clyde agreed, a determined glint in his eyes. Clyde smiled at Jed, offering reassurance. And they will be, kiddo. Don't you worry. We'll get these guys. By my reckoning, there's only the Carter brothers and Reg left, and maybe a hanger-on or two. Clyde encouraged his horse to start moving, adding, Come on, we have no time to waste. Clyde and Jed, mounted on their horses, galloped out of town, following a trodden path through the barren desert terrain. The vast emptiness was broken only by occasional cacti and the distant mountains that punctuated the flat horizon. After a couple of hours of travel, the scorching sun began to take its toll on the two men. They decided to stop and seek respite in the shade of a towering rock located near the pathway. Damn, it's hot today, isn't it? Clyde remarked, loosening his shirt and removing his hat. Shaking his hat to summon some fresh air and shoo away the flies, Clyde dismounted his horse and opened his water bottle. Take a few minutes, Jed. Loosen up and cool down a bit. We've covered a lot of ground, and I believe we're near the hideout, Clyde said, taking a sip of water and splashing some on his head. Curious, Jed inquired. How do you know where their hideout is? Somebody in town whispered it to me. I didn't find out much else, but I reckon we're close now. It's about another mile and a half that way. Clyde pointed over his shoulder, indicating a cluster of trees in the distance. They've got a place in that area, or so I was told. We'll have to leave the horses soon when we get closer and find a way to sneak around, Clyde explained. But what if there are 5 of them? Can we take on 5? Jed voiced his concerns. At most, there might be 5, but it could be fewer. We won't know until we get there. All we're going to do is gather information and find out who's there, okay? Clyde nodded at Jed, seeking his approval. Jed responded with an approving nod and took a drink from his water bottle. Meanwhile, back in the town they had recently left, Hank, Pete, and Jake, the 3 remaining members of the Black Hand gang, rode into town on horseback. As they passed through, Emily, the handmaid nurse, was making her way through town when Pete grabbed her arm, laughing. Come here, pretty! Let me buy you a drink at the bar, Pete called out, amusement lacing his voice. Emily tried to pull herself free, letting out a scream. Get off me! She shook herself vigorously, attempting to break free. Hank cast a cold stare at Pete, and he released Emily's arm. Huh! Just a bit of fun. You guys are like tombstones, Pete taunted, observing the stone-cold, unyielding expressions on Hank and his Jake's faces. Emily quickly scurried off into the safety of the post office building, while the gang dismounted their horses near the saloon. They tied their horses outside, then made their way towards the saloon's entrance. Hank pushed open the doors, and the 3 ominous men stepped inside. As they entered, a man seated at the bar swiftly turned around, drawing his gun from his holster on his left side and pointing it directly at Hank, freezing him in his tracks. Billy! Well, fancy meeting you here? Hank tried to break the tension with a smile, but his nervousness seeped through, evidenced by the bead of sweat forming on his forehead and his trembling hands. Don't make a move, Hank! Stay real still, Billy warned, rising slowly from his barstool, his gun unwaveringly aimed at Hank. Pete and the other gang members stood silently behind Hank, just inside the saloon doors, while Billy gestured for them to step aside. You 2 step aside. Take 2 steps and keep your hands up, Billy commanded, and the 2 men complied. You know, Billy? I never meant for that to happen. It wasn't our fault. When you think of... Hank attempted to soften the situation, but Billy interrupted him sharply. Shut the hell up, Hank. What's done is done. We can't change that now, but I'm not going to let something like that happen again. I can't. You're going to pay, Hank. Don't you dare. Billy's voice resonated through the saloon as he confronted Pete, who had started to lower one of his hands. Slowly, take your gun out and put it down on the table, Billy instructed Pete, who complied, placing his gun on the table. Billy unloaded Pete's gun and pushed it aside. You too. Billy turned his attention to Jake, who cautiously handed over his gun. So, you're going to take me and Billy? Hank inquired, a hint of defiance in his voice. Billy remained silent, his gun trained on Hank. You're going to shoot me? Oh, come on. Hank began to move side to side, but Billy warned him sternly. Don't move. Hank froze in place, and a heavy silence descended upon the room. Chapter 8. A Showdown in Shadows. The saloon fell into a tense silence as Billy held Hank at gunpoint. The air grew heavy with anticipation as the two men locked eyes, their past grievances simmering beneath the surface. Hank, desperate to buy himself a chance, broke the silence. Billy, let's settle this like men, Hank proposed, his voice laced with a mix of fear and determination. A flicker of curiosity danced in Billy's eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. Tossing it into the air, he called out, Heads, we have ourselves a duel. Tails, you meet your end right here. The coin spun through the air, catching glimmers of light as it twirled. Time seemed to stand still as it descended, the room holding its breath. Then, with a soft thud, the coin landed on the ground, revealing the symbol of a regal head facing upward. Heads. A collective gasp swept through the saloon, and the tension tightened its grip. The duel was on. Billy and Hank stepped outside, away from prying eyes, to a desolate corner of the town. Shadows danced around them as they faced each other, both knowing that only one would walk away from this confrontation. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying the weight of their impending clash. Billy's hand twitched near his gun, while Hank remained still, his eyes locked on his opponent. With a swift draw, the silence shattered as gunfire erupted. Shots rang out, cutting through the air like lightning bolts. The echoes reverberated against the buildings as the men exchanged bullets, each trying to outmaneuver the other. In a moment of fate, Hank's bullet found its mark, striking Billy square in the chest. The outlaw staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing to the ground. The dust settled, and Hank stood there, victorious but weary. The remaining gang members returned to the saloon, shaken by the duel. Seeking solace in liquor, they drowned their sorrows and celebrated the fallen with a mix of revelry and sorrow. Pete, ever the troublemaker, couldn't resist his base impulses and began harassing Emily once again. His crude advances and unwelcome laughter pierced the air, tarnishing the already somber atmosphere. Meanwhile, Jake, fueled by a potent combination of alcohol and aggression, engaged in a brawl with a local patron. Fists flew, crashing into flesh and bone, as the sounds of grunts and thuds filled the room. The cause of the altercation was unclear, lost in a haze of blurred judgment and wounded pride. As the chaos unfolded, the gang members huddled together, their minds clouded by intoxication and their actions consumed by lawlessness. Plans began to take shape, and they decided to seek refuge at the local hotel inn, where they could find respite and regroup. Unbeknownst to them, Emily, the handmaid nurse, witnessed the mayhem and sensed the danger it posed to the town. Determined to alert the ones who could restore order, she dispatched a young boy to find Jed and Clyde, urging them to return and face the trouble that had befallen the town. The boy darted through the dimly lit streets, his footsteps echoing against the wooden facades. His mission carried the weight of urgency, for the fate of the town now rested on the shoulders of those brave enough to confront the lawless storm approaching. Mounting a horse, he then rode out of town swiftly. Meanwhile, near the Bones Gang hideout, Clyde and Jed crept through the dense undergrowth, their movements cautious and deliberate. The shack stood before them, hidden amidst the gnarled trees and enveloped by an eerie silence. The air was thick with anticipation as the two bounty hunters assessed their surroundings. Vines snaked their way up the weathered walls of the shacks, their tendrils entwined with patches of green mold. Clyde and Jed exchanged a silent nod, a silent agreement to proceed further and investigate. "Let's take a closer look," Jed suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Clyde led the way, slowly inching forward on his belly, his senses heightened, absorbing every detail of their surroundings. Jed followed suit, mirroring Clyde's movements, their bodies melding with the shadows. The vulture perched on one of the shack roofs peered at them with a watchful eye, its presence serving as a haunting omen. Reaching a vantage point closer to the shacks, Clyde motioned for Jed to remain still, his finger pressed to his lips in a gesture of silence. He approached the first shack and attempted to push open the door, only to find it locked, denying them entry. Undeterred, Clyde moved towards the second shack, determination etched across his face. With a firm push, the door yielded, emitting a short creak that seemed to echo through the stillness. Clyde turned back to Jed and whispered, "You stay here, all right?" Jed nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of anticipation and caution, as Clyde disappeared into the dimly lit interior of the small shack. Moments ticked by as Jed's heart thumped in his chest, the weight of the unknown hanging heavily in the air. Clyde reemerged from the shack, his steps cautious and deliberate. He joined Jed's side and whispered, "No one's here, but it's clear they've been here recently. I reckon they've started heading north." The two bounty hunters exchanged a meaningful glance, understanding the urgency that fueled their pursuit. There was no time to waste, no room for doubt. They needed to catch up with the Bones Gang before their trail grew cold. Jed's gaze wandered towards the second shack, curiosity getting the better of him. He approached the weathered structure, studying its worn exterior. Inside, he found 3 chairs arranged around a sturdy wooden table, worn and weathered from years of use. A solitary candlestick rested on a ledge, its wax residue a testament to recent occupation. Beside it lay 2 discarded cigarette ends, a subtle trace of the gang's presence. Clyde, sensing Jed's curiosity, joined him in the second shack. Together, they surveyed the sparsely furnished space, searching for any clue that could guide them further. Their eyes landed on a small painting hanging on the wall, a scene of a vibrant sunset over a sprawling landscape, a stark contrast to the darkness and lawlessness that plagued their current path. The bounty hunters exchanged a glance, their determination reinforced by the knowledge that their pursuit was just. With a renewed sense of purpose, Clyde and Jed resumed their search, scouring every nook and cranny of the shacks. Yet, aside from the remnants of their recent presence, the shacks revealed no further secrets. Silence hung heavy in the air as Clyde and Jed exited the shacks, their faces etched with a mix of determination and frustration. They knew their time was running out, their window of opportunity narrowing. As they stood outside, surveying the wilderness that lay before them, a sense of urgency gripped their hearts. "We need to keep moving," Clyde said, his voice laced with resolve. "They're headed north, possibly to New Mexico, Santa Fe, and we're not far behind." Jed nodded, his determination unwavering. The hunt was far from over, and the 2 bounty hunters would stop at nothing to bring the Bones Gang to justice. Their path was clear, their destination set, and the journey ahead promised a reckoning they could no longer delay. But just as they mounted their horses, a peculiar sound carried through the air, catching Clyde and Jed's attention. It was a melodic whistle, resembling the call of a bird. They strained their ears, trying to identify the source of the sound. "What in tarnation is that?" Jed wondered aloud, furrowing his brow. Clyde listened intently, recognizing the distinct pattern of the whistle. "That ain't no bird, Jed. It's a flute or some sort of instrument. Someone's trying to get our attention." Curiosity piqued, they guided their horses in the direction of the sound. The melodic notes grew louder as they ventured closer to the source. Soon, they spotted a young boy, perched atop a fallen tree trunk, playing the instrument. "Hey there, young fella," Clyde called out, reining in his horse. "What brings you out here playing that tune?" The boy ceased playing and looked up, his eyes wide with excitement. "Miss Emily sent me to find you. There's trouble in town. The gang, there's 3 of them, they caused a ruckus at the saloon and beat up a fella real bad. Miss Emily said you gotta come quick. They've been scaring Emily, I think." Clyde and Jed exchanged concerned glances. "Lead the way, son," Clyde instructed, his voice filled with urgency. The rugged landscape stretched out before Clyde and Jed as they rode back to Cedar Ridge. The sun began its descent, casting a golden hue over the vast expanse of rolling hills and distant mountains. Dusty trails wound through the arid terrain, leading them closer to their destination. The air was dry, carrying the whispers of the wind that rustled through the sparse vegetation. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they galloped along the trail, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats echoing through the open landscape. Clyde and Jed focused on the path ahead, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. The tension in their bodies mirrored the mounting anticipation of what awaited them in Cedar Ridge. Cutting to the scene at the Hotel Inn in Cedar Ridge, the air inside was thick with the smell of alcohol and the sound of raucous laughter. Pete, fueled by his ill intentions, cornered Emily near the bar. Her tear-stained face pleaded for help as she desperately cried out for assistance. An elderly man, sitting at a nearby table, couldn't bear to witness Pete's aggression towards Emily. Rising from his chair with a determined expression, he attempted to intervene. But Pete, fueled by his arrogance, shoved the old man aside, causing him to stumble and fall. Meanwhile, Jake, the brute of the gang, was busy ransacking the cashier machine, a malicious grin etched across his face. The terrified staff had fled, seeking refuge in the safety of hidden corners, leaving Jake to continue his rampage undisturbed. Hank, the only semblance of reason among the gang members, stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. "Pete, leave her be," he commanded sternly, his voice laced with authority. But Pete, fueled by his unruly nature, paid no heed to Hank's plea, his grip on Emily tightening. Emily's cries for help filled the room, reverberating off the walls and mingling with the chaotic atmosphere. The tension in the air was palpable as Clyde and Jed burst through the doors of the Hotel Inn, their eyes blazing with determination. It was time to put an end to the Bones gang's reign of terror and rescue the innocent from their clutches. Clyde and Jed dismounted their horses and pushed through the crowd gathering near the saloon. Broken chairs and shattered bottles littered the ground, remnants of the Black Hand gang's violent outburst. Amongst the onlookers, they spotted Emily, her face etched with worry. Clyde, Jed and the boy walked over to where Emily was approaching and Clyde said, "What's happened, miss?" said Clyde with a genuine sense of concern. Emily sobbed and fell to her knees in front of Clyde and Jed. "Oh, they've been terrorizing the town, they done teased before. We can't stop them. Noon round here ever does anything." Emily cried and sobbed on the floor and Jed helped her up and tried to comfort her. "Now miss, please don't cry, we're gonna try sort things out here, okay?" said Jed as he helped Emily to her feet. Emily, still sobbing, begged, Please, mister, can you get them out of here? Please?" Emily touched Clyde on his chest. "One of them is a wanted man, And we're bounty hunters, ma'am. If the other men interfere, I will have to take them too," said Clyde, who already seemed to have a plan and confidence. To say it, Jed spun the barrel on his gun, checking his equipment, then putting his gun back into his holster, he exclaimed, "Here they are!" and pointed to the other end of town where the 3 gang members staggered out of the hotel inn. Pete was waving his gun around. Jake and Hank seemed a lot more colder and reserved. "Oh look, it's those bounty hunters, Hank." Pete joked about the price on Hank's life. "I reckon they've come for that reward." Jake, Hank and Pete stood in the middle of the clearing at one end and Clyde and Jed stood still at the other end. "Well, isn't this romantic?" said Hank, taking 2 steps forward and gesturing his hand back at Pete to tell him, "Put your gun away, Pete." Pete frowned, grunted, then put his gun into his holster. Clyde and Jed took a few steady steps forward, then stopped. "Do you want to do this the easy way, Hank?" "Hand yourself in?" said Clyde, offering Hank the cons to be taken in alive. "Hell no! I'd rather die in the desert than spend another night in one of those sheriff jails. Heck no! Let's see if you can take me, boy. On your own, just you and me?" Hank held his hands up in the air and took another 2 steps forward. "I swear none of these 2 will lift a finger. We will honor the duel. What do you say?" said Hank with an almost smiling, friendly face. He seemed genuinely excited to be in this confrontation. "So you would rather die?" said Clyde. Hank stared for a second or 2, then laughed. "Ha! You're scared of the challenge. I can sense fear in you, boy. What's your name?" said Hank. "Hank, let's just bust these up." "What are you doing?" said Jake angrily with his hand urgently on top of his gun holster. "Jake, look at this." Hank looked around at the scene and then referred back to Jake. "It's perfect, and it was these guys whose friend killed Joe in the shootout. I get a chance at squaring things up." Jake then corrected Hank. "But Joe said we leave it, honor the duel, remember?" Pete spat on the ground in disgust. "Joe ain't around anymore, Jake. There's just the 3 of us. Remember when we were 5 men strong?" Hank seemed to be getting a bit sentimental for a moment, but then turned back to face Clyde. "What do you say? A duel shootout, come on." "It's perfect, okay," said Clyde, taking 2 steps back. Hank gestured to Jake and Pete to get out of the way and head back to the other end of town. Jed moved to one side and stood just inside the post office doorway over the other side. Clyde stood at one end and Hank at the other, the 2 men prepared for the standoff. A woman in a nearby house shut her window and blinds. Clyde stood watchfully for any move from Hank. Hank stood, a ball of sweat forming on his head, just about to drip onto his eyebrow. Then all of a sudden he grabs his gun and pulls it out to aim at Clyde. A bullet hits Hank in the chest, then another hits his chest, sending him falling backwards onto the ground. Hank's gun fell onto his leg as he rolled on the floor and died. At the other end of town, the shadows of Jake and Pete could be seen, agitated by the loss of their gang member, Hank. Pete let out a shot from his gun up and out the air, and then the 2 men got on their horses to get out of town. "Never mind them. I think they got the message," said Clyde to Emily. "But what if they come back?" "They're always trouble, those lot," said Emily, somewhat distressed. "I don't think they'll be back for a while." "We can try figure something out, miss, don't you worry," said Jed, as he tried to reassure Emily. Chapter 9. Pursuit renewed. The sun cast a warm glow over Cedar Ridge as Clyde and Jed sat inside the hotel inn, sharing a meal with Emily. The aroma of freshly cooked food wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations. It was a momentary respite from the chaos that had consumed their lives. Clyde's gaze wandered to the wanted poster hanging on the wall nearby, displaying Hank Allison's face and the hefty reward for his capture. The weight of their recent dual shootout still lingered in his mind, but he knew that the pursuit of justice was far from over. With a determined look in his eyes, Clyde leaned forward and said, "Emily, we appreciate everything you've done for us." Hank was a dangerous man, and his reign of terror ends today. He paused briefly, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. But Jed and I have unfinished business. The Bones gang must be brought to justice, and we won't rest until it's done. Clyde continued, his voice filled with a resolute determination. We're grateful for your help, but we need to get back on the trail and ensure that no one else suffers at their hands. Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and concern. I understand, she replied softly. You have a duty to protect others from the Bones gang's wrath. But promise me you'll stay safe, both of you. Clyde offered a reassuring smile. We'll do our best. Emily, we've come this far, and we won't let anything stop us. The town of Cedar Ridge will be safer once the Bones gang is no more. Their lunch concluded, Clyde and Jed bid farewell to Emily, leaving her with a renewed sense of hope amidst the turmoil. The dusty streets of Cedar Ridge welcomed them as they made their way to the local sheriff's office, their footsteps echoing against the wooden boardwalk. Inside the sheriff's office, the air carried the scent of ink and old leather. Clyde approached the sheriff, presenting the proof of Hank's demise and his identification as a renowned bounty hunter. The sheriff's eyes widened in recognition, a mixture of respect and caution evident in his expression. After a brief exchange, the sheriff counted out a stack of bills and handed it to Clyde. It was the reward he had earned for bringing down Hank Allison, a testament to his skill and the danger he had faced. Clyde tucked the money away safely, a symbol of his dedication to justice. With their reward secured, Clyde and Jed ventured back to the Hotel Inn, where they found Emily waiting anxiously. The three of them sat together, their conversation filled with a mix of determination and shared purpose. Plans were laid, strategies formed, and a renewed sense of urgency took hold. As they prepared to embark on their next journey, the town of Cedar Ridge stood as a testament to their resolve. The bones of the past would be buried, and the future held the promise of redemption. With the memory of Hank's demise still fresh in their minds, Clyde and Jed were ready to resume the hunt, their sights firmly set on the remaining members of the Bones gang. Clyde and Jed walked to their horses, untied them, and saddled up. As they began to trek out of tune, the young messenger boy from earlier ran up to them. "Please, can I come with you?" he begged. Clyde frowned at the idea. "No! You stay here, understand? It's best for you," said Clyde. The boy agreed and backed off. "Sorry, kid, you stay and look after Emily, okay?" said Jed as they galloped away. Clyde and Jed, on horseback, left the town with a trail of dust behind them and retraced their tracks across the landscape to the Bones hideout they had found earlier. It took a long time to get there, but eventually they rested in that area for a moment. Meanwhile, Brian and George Carter were traveling north on horseback with their 2 bags of loot and a man named Jasper who was following them on foot. "Anything I can do for you fellas?" said Jasper, hobbling alongside the 2 men on horses. "Where's your horse at?" said George to Jasper. "I ain't got no horse, had no horse for nearly a year now," said Jasper, almost out of breath. "What the heck you doing all the way out here?" "On foot?" said George curiously. "I've been foraging, collecting things you know." Jasper hobbled along hurriedly with the 2 men on horses. "If you got a bottle of water, it goes a long way out here," said Jasper. "You're crazy," said George, almost laughing. "What things you been collecting, Jasper?" said Brian, looking tired on his horse. "Herbs, cacti, leaves and things," said Jasper, who then took a drink from his water bottle. "What you gonna do with that lot then?" said George. George and Brian on their horses began to pick up speed again, and yet Jasper managed to keep up on foot. "If you need any help, there's a couple of men back at my place. They would do just about anything for a few pieces of that gold you got there." As Jasper said this, the 2 men slowed to a halt on their horses. What makes you think we got gold here, son? Said George, curiously. What else is gonna be so heavy it slows you down so much? Come on. Anyway, these two men been asking for any kind of work, and I mean anything, and I'd rather they did some work with you, you know. Otherwise they're gonna be trouble to someone, said Jasper with a sincere look on his face as he stopped walking and caught his breath. What's their names? Said Brian. Jasper thought for a moment, his face squinting, then spoke. Warren and Hick, that's their names. I don't know where they're from, but they like a drink, and when they've had a bit too much, they can be trouble. I'd rather they had some work to focus on, sir, said Jasper, bargaining with the Carter brothers. We'll think about it. Tell me a little bit about Warren and Hick, said Brian as he and George began to pick up pace again on their horses. Jasper walked hurriedly beside them, speaking between bouts of catching his breath. I don't know that much, sir. They only been with me 3 days, and one of them don't talk that much at all. They like to play cards sometimes, or shoot at things in the field. I think they are lost, like a lot of people out here these days, maybe from a broken family or tragedy or something, said Jasper. Brian and George continued on their horses, getting a little faster, yet Jasper still managed to keep up. I don't know anything else really, sir. They came into town 3 days ago and I gave them a roof. I can't say much more than that, said Jasper. 3 days? Said Brian, frowning at Jasper. 3 days with them? And you don't know anything about these guys? Jasper squinted his eyes and frowned. Well, I can't say they told me much more. I think they've lost parents or an older brother in some tragedy in their town. They haven't told me anything, though. It's just what I sense, from what I've picked up, said Jasper. Brian continued forward. George also and Japser tagged along. So what do you say? Will you give them a try? Give them a job? Said Japser. Brian thought about it, then came to the conclusion. We don't need nobody. We're fine on our own, he concluded. But what about the… George stopped when Brian looked at him and interrupted with, We don't need anybody, we can handle this, said Brian, but George didn't seem to agree. We can't risk it. Look what they've done so far, everyone's gone. There were 5 of us just a few days ago, said George, almost upset. Brian gave George a tired look. Look, George, they're just 2 more guys on the road. How many of their type have we come across in our time? Said Brian. With that, George and Brian continued and were near to Jasper's home village. Back at the hideout, Clyde and Jed left on their horses, quick on the trail of the Carter brothers and whoever else may be left of the Bones gang. Come on! They got a heavy load, so they can't be too far ahead. Let's get after them. On their horses, getting a little faster, yet Jasper still managed to keep up. I don't know anything else really, sir. They came into town 3 days ago and I gave them a roof. I can't say much more than that, said Jasper. 3 days? Said Brian, frowning at Jasper. 3 days with them? And you don't know anything about these guys? Jasper squinted his eyes and frowned. Well, I can't say they told me much more. I think they've lost parents or an older brother in some tragedy in their town. They haven't told me anything, though. It's just what I sense, from what I've picked up, said Jasper. Brian continued forward. George also and Japser tagged along. So what do you say? Will you give them a try? Give them a job? Said Japser. Brian thought about it, then came to the conclusion. We don't need nobody. We're fine on our own, he concluded. But what about the… George stopped when Brian looked at him and interrupted with, We don't need anybody, we can handle this, said Brian, but George didn't seem to agree. We can't risk it. Look what they've done so far, everyone's gone. There were 5 of us just a few days ago, said George, almost upset. Brian gave George a tired look. Look, George, they're just 2 more guys on the road. How many of their type have we come across in our time? Said Brian. With that, George and Brian continued and were near to Jasper's home village. Back at the hideout, Clyde and Jed left on their horses, quick on the trail of the Carter brothers and whoever else may be left of the Bones gang. Come on! They got a heavy load, so they can't be too far ahead. Let's get after them, said Jed, racing ahead. Clyde soon followed him. Brian and George, accompanied by their friend Jasper, rode into the small town of Silverton. The dusty streets were lined with weathered buildings, and the sound of hooves echoed through the quiet town. Jasper led them to his modest residence, a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where he introduced them to his acquaintances, Warren and Hick. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Warren sat by the fireplace cleaning his revolver, while Hick leaned against the wall, a cigarette hanging from his lips. Brian, curious about their experiences, asked Warren, "You ever shot a man before?" Warren smirked and replied, "Hell yeah, I've shot about 6 men, ain't that right, Hick?" Hick nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of wariness and resilience. Brian turned to Hick and asked, "You ever shot a man before, Hick?" Hick took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Ain't nothing shooting a man," he said, his voice laced with a hint of weariness. "It's living with it after that's the hard part." George, sensing an opportunity, spoke up. "We got a couple of mean bounty hunters on our trail. If you boys could warn them off, stop them from passing through, we would reward you, of course." George reached into his pocket, revealing a gleaming gold coin. He tossed one to Hick and another to Warren, their eyes lighting up with greed. The 2 men fixated on their newly acquired gold coins, their thoughts consumed by the possibilities. But the air grew heavy as George's tone turned sinister. "I'll give you 5 more each if you bring their heads to question mark over the border," George said, an evil glint in his eyes that sent a shiver down even Brian's spine. Warren and Hick exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Hick finally spoke. "Okay, where do we bring them afterward?" George's smirk widened. "The first town over the border, with the well in the middle of 4 white buildings. You'll know it when you get there. If you only manage to scare them off, I'll give you 3 coins each." The 2 men nodded, their determination fueled by the allure of gold. "Okay, but you better be there when we come over tomorrow," Hick warned. Brian nodded firmly. "We will be." As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Brian sensed the eagerness burning in the eyes of Warren and Hick. These young men would be a formidable distraction if the bounty hunters ventured this way. "Remember," Brian added, "if you do this job well, we might have other work for you. Keep it sweet, okay?" With a final nod, Brian and George kicked their horses into a gallop, leaving Silverton behind as they rode toward the border. The shadows of Silverton whispered of the dangerous pact they had just made, their actions veiled by the desolate landscape that stretched out before them. Chapter 9. Pursuit renewed. The sun cast a warm glow over Cedar Ridge as Clyde and Jed sat inside the Hotel Inn, sharing a meal with Emily. The aroma of freshly cooked food wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations. It was a momentary respite from the chaos that had consumed their lives. Clyde's gaze wandered to the wanted poster hanging on the wall nearby, displaying Hank Allison's face and the hefty reward for his capture. The weight of their recent duel shootout still lingered in his mind, but he knew that the pursuit of justice was far from over. With a determined look in his eyes, Clyde leaned forward and said, "Emily, we appreciate everything you've done for us. Hank was a dangerous man, and his reign of terror ends today." He paused briefly, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. "But Jed and I have unfinished business. The Bones gang must be brought to justice, and we won't rest until it's done." Clyde continued, his voice filled with a resolute determination. "We're grateful for your help, but we need to get back on the trail and ensure that no one else suffers at their hands." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and concern. "I understand," she replied softly. "You have a duty to protect others from the Bones gang's wrath. But promise me you'll stay safe, both of you." Clyde offered a reassuring smile. "We'll do our best, Emily. We've come this far, and we won't let anything stop us. The town of Cedar Ridge will be safer once the Bones gang is no more." Their lunch concluded, Clyde and Jed bid farewell to Emily, leaving her with a renewed sense of hope amidst the turmoil. The dusty streets of Cedar Ridge welcomed them as they made their way to the local sheriff's office, their footsteps echoing against the wooden boardwalk. Inside the sheriff's office, the air carried the scent of ink and old leather. Clyde approached the sheriff, presenting the proof of Hank's demise and his identification as a renowned bounty hunter. The sheriff's eyes widened in recognition, a mixture of respect and caution evident in his expression. After a brief exchange, the sheriff counted out a stack of bills and handed it to Clyde. It was the reward he had earned for bringing down Hank Allison, a testament to his skill and the danger he had faced. Clyde tucked the money away safely, a symbol of his dedication to justice. With their reward secured, Clyde and Jed ventured back to the Hotel Inn, where they found Emily waiting anxiously. The three of them sat together, their conversation filled with a mix of determination and shared purpose. Plans were laid, strategies formed, and a renewed sense of urgency took hold. As they prepared to embark on their next journey, the town of Cedar Ridge stood as a testament to their resolve. The bones of the past would be buried, and the future held the promise of redemption. With the memory of Hank's demise still fresh in their minds, Clyde and Jed were ready to resume the hunt, their sights firmly set on the remaining members of the Bones gang. Clyde and Jed walked to their horses, untied them, and saddled up. As they began to trek out of tune, the young messenger boy from earlier ran up to them. "Please, can I come with you?" he begged. Clyde frowned at the idea. "No! You stay here, understand? It's best for you," said Clyde. The boy agreed and backed off. "Sorry, kid, you stay and look after Emily, okay?" said Jed as they galloped away. Clyde and Jed, on horseback, left the town with a trail of dust behind them and retraced their tracks across the landscape to the Bones hideout they had found earlier. It took a long time to get there, but eventually they rested in that area for a moment. Meanwhile, Brian and George Carter were traveling north on horseback with the 2 bags of loot and a man named Jasper who was following them on foot. "Anything I can do for you fellas?" said Jasper, hobbling alongside the 2 men on horses. "Where's your horse at?" said George to Jasper. "I ain't got no horse, had no horse for nearly a year now," said Jasper, almost out of breath. "What the heck? You doing all the way out here? On foot?" said George curiously. "I've been foraging, collecting things, you know." Jasper hobbled along hurriedly with the 2 men on horses. "If you got a bottle of water, it goes a long way out here," said Jasper. "You're crazy," said George, almost laughing. "What things you been collecting, Jasper?" said Brian, looking tired on his horse. "Herbs, cacti, leaves and things," said Jasper, who then took a drink from his water bottle. "What you gonna do with that lot then?" said George. George and Brian on their horses began to pick up speed again, and yet Jasper managed to keep up on foot. "If you need any help, there's a couple of men back at my place. They would do just about anything for a few pieces of that gold you got there." As Jasper said this, the 2 men slowed to a halt on their horses. "What makes you think we got gold here, son?" said George curiously. "What else is gonna be so heavy it slows you down so much? Come on. Anyway, these 2 men been asking for any kind of work, and I mean anything, and I'd rather they did some work with you, you know. Otherwise they're gonna be trouble to someone," said Jasper with a sincere look on his face as he stopped walking and caught his breath. "What's their names?" said Brian. Jasper thought for a moment, his face squinting, then spoke. "Warren and Hick, that's their names. I don't know where they're from, but they like a drink, and when they've had a bit too much, they can be trouble. I'd rather they had some work to focus on, sir," said Jasper, bargaining with the Carter brothers. "We'll think about it. Tell me a little bit about Warren and Hick," said Brian as he and George began to pick up pace again on their horses. Jasper walked hurriedly beside them, speaking between bouts of catching his breath. "I don't know that much, sir. They only been with me 3 days, and one of them don't talk that much at all. They like to play cards sometimes, or shoot at things in the field. I think they are lost, like a lot of people out here these days, maybe from a broken family or tragedy or something," said Jasper, Brian and George continued on their horses, getting a little faster, yet Jasper still managed to keep up. I don't know anything else really, sir. They came into town 3 days ago and I gave them a roof. I can't say much more than that, said Jasper. 3 days? Said Brian, frowning at Jasper. 3 days with them? And you don't know anything about these guys? Jasper squinted his eyes and frowned. Well, I can't say they told me much more. I think they've lost parents or an older brother in some tragedy in their town. They haven't told me anything, though. It's just what I sense, from what I've picked up, said Jasper. Brian continued forward, George also and Japser tagged along. So what do you say? Will you give them a try? Give them a job? Said Japser. Brian thought about it, then came to the conclusion. We don't need nobody, we're fine on our own, he concluded. But what about the… George stopped when Brian looked at him and interrupted with, We don't need anybody, we can handle this, said Brian, but George didn't seem to agree. We can't risk it, look what they've done so far, everyone's gone. There were 5 of us. Just a few days ago, said George, almost upset. Brian gave George a tired look. Look, George, they're just 2 more guys on the road. How many of their type have we come across in our time? Said Brian. With that, George and Brian continued and were near to Jasper's home village. Back at the hideout, Clyde and Jed left on their horses, quick on the trail of the Carter brothers and whoever else may be left of the Bones gang. Come on. They got a heavy load, so they can't be too far ahead. Let's get after them, said Jed, racing ahead. Clyde soon followed him. Brian and George, accompanied by their friend Jasper, rode into the small town of Silverton. The dusty streets were lined with weathered buildings, and the sound of hooves echoed through the quiet town. Jasper led them to his modest residence, a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where he introduced them to his acquaintances, Warren and Hick. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Warren sat by the fireplace cleaning his revolver, while Hick leaned against the wall, a cigarette hanging from his lips. Brian, curious about their experiences, asked Warren, You ever shot a man before? Warren smirked and replied, Hell yeah, I've shot about 6 men, ain't that right, Hick? Hick nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of wariness and resilience. Brian turned to Hick and asked, You ever shot a man before, Hick? Hick took a drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. Ain't nothing shooting a man, he said, his voice laced with a hint of weariness. It's living with it after that's the hard part. George, sensing an opportunity, spoke up. We got a couple of mean bounty hunters on our trail. If you boys could warn them off, stop them from passing through, we would reward you, of course. George reached into his pocket, revealing a gleaming gold coin. He tossed one to Hick and another to Warren, their eyes lighting up with greed. The 2 men fixated on their newly acquired gold coins, their thoughts consumed by the possibilities. But the air grew heavy as George's tone turned sinister. I'll give you 5 more each if you bring their heads to question mark over the border, George said, an evil glint in his eyes that sent a shiver down even Brian's spine. Warren and Hick exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Hick finally spoke. Okay, where do we bring them afterward? George's smirk widened. The first town over the border, with the well in the middle of 4 white buildings. You'll know it when you get there. If you only manage to scare them off, I'll give you 3 coins each. The 2 men nodded, their determination fueled by the allure of gold. Okay, but you better be there when we come over tomorrow, Hick warned. Brian nodded firmly. We will be. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Brian sensed the eagerness burning in the eyes of Warren and Hick. These young men would be a formidable distraction if the bounty hunters ventured this way. Remember, Brian added, if you do this job well, we might have other work for you. Keep it sweet, okay? With a final nod, Brian and George kicked their horses into a gallop, leaving Silverton behind as they rode toward the border. The shadows of Silverton whispered of the dangerous pact they had just made, their actions veiled by the desolate landscape that stretched out before them. Warren and Hick ticked their piece of gold each into their inside pockets. Jasper stood aside and took note. The two young men got their guns out and then asked Jasper, "You got any firepower?" "A shotgun?" said Hick. Jasper hesitantly replied, I got one for hire, with 12 shells if that's any good," said Jasper. "For hire? How much?" said Warren. "One of them pieces of gold, you can have it for a day. But you gotta bring it back, I need it round here," said Jasper, getting a bit nervous about the situation. "Is it any good for long range?" said Hick. "It'll get to about that tree over there." Jasper pointed to a tree not far away just outside his fence. "That'll do," said Warren. "Give him your piece of gold, Hick," said Warren. Hick frowned and stepped back away from Warren. "Heck no! Give him your piece of gold, Warren," said Hick in disgust, then continued. "We don't need the shotgun anyhow, we got enough here with these pistols," said Hick. Warren spoke to Jasper. "Here, get me the shotgun. And I'll give you this piece of gold, I want the 12 shells Oswell," he said with a sense of authority. Jasper went to a cupboard and pulled out the shotgun and some shells. He handed them over to Warren, then took his piece of gold. Jasper smiled at the sight and feel of the gold coin in his hand. The potential it held. After loading the shotgun, Warren moved over to the side of the outside of the house and found a wall he and Hick could stand behind, giving them a bit cover if the two bounty hunters came into town this way. "This is perfect. We're almost totally covered here and we can fire in most of that direction. Once they get close, this won't be too difficult," said Warren with some confidence. "Bring one of them chairs out here, Jasper, will you?" said Warren, taking a drink of his bottle, probably beer, and checking the shotgun over. "Ain't you a bit scared, Warren?" said Hick as he stood a couple of inches shorter than Warren, next to him about a foot away. "Scared? What do you mean?" said Warren, not understanding Hick. "Well, I mean, these are bounty hunters, Warren, think about it," said Hick. Warren looked into the distance and imagined the thought of two bounty hunters, men who'd take in wanted men, or even shoot them dead, for a reward. He imagined what these men would do and then got frightened at the idea of the bounty hunters shooting him and Hick dead. "I ain't scared, we want those gold coins, don't we?" said Warren as he sat on the chair that Jasper had just brought out. "We do, but let's be real, these are bounty hunters, Warren, it's what they do. We gotta be on our feet, I mean, how are we going to outshoot them?" said Hick. "Will you shut up?" said Warren abruptly, and then added, "We'll just do it when it happens, no good going on about it, is there? Have a drink and relax, will you? There's no sign of them yet," said Warren. Hick grabbed his bottle from the window ledge and took a drink. Jasper hurried nervously back into the house. "Where you going?" said Hick to Jasper just as she stood at the doorway. "No good me being out here, is there? Besides, I haven't got a gun, I'm too old for this," said Jasper, who then opened the door and went to hide in his house. "That's right, you hide away in there, you're useless anyway." "Stupid man," said Hick angrily. There was a little rain starting to gently fall. It felt like a blissful moment until Warren jumped out of his seat. "They're there! They're coming! Look, we better duck down, don't let them see us," said Warren. Warren and Hick ducked, hiding behind the wall, readying themselves while watching two silhouettes of men on horses approaching from the horizon. Their almost straight trail would lead them here in less than half an hour. Chapter 10. Shadows of Silverton. Clyde and Jed eased their horses' pace as they approached the outskirts of Silverton. The air was thick with tension, the quiet town seeming to hold its breath. Unbeknownst to them, Hick and Warren cowered nervously behind the safety of a wooden wall, their trembling hands gripping their weapons tightly. Suddenly, Warren's fear overtook him, and he hastily raised his shotgun, taking aim at Clyde. A deafening blast echoed through the air, missing its intended targets, but startling the horses. The frightened animals reared up, their hooves kicking the air as Clyde and Jed struggled to regain control. In the midst of the chaos, a woman's piercing scream pierced the silence, reverberating through the town. Startled, a cat darted beneath the floorboards of the saloon, and fearful faces peered out from behind half-closed windows. As the dust settled, Hick emerged from behind the wall, seeking vengeance. He aimed his weapon at Jed, but before he could pull the trigger, Clyde's precise shot struck him square in the head. Hick's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, a testament to the quick and deadly accuracy of the bounty hunter. Warren, filled with rage and grief, emerged from his hiding place, his shotgun raised, and his voice filled with fury. "Die!" he shouted, unleashing a barrage of shotgun blasts in Clyde's direction. Yet, his aim faltered, missing his target entirely. Jed's well-aimed bullet struck Warren in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Breathing heavily, Jed dismounted his horse and approached the fallen bodies. He checked Hick's pockets and found a piece of gold, confirming their suspicion that the Bones gang had paid them off. Clyde, scanning the town for any signs or clues, instructed Jed to search Warren. Disappointed, Jed reported, "No piece of gold here. Maybe they were only paid with one." Without further delay, Clyde made the decision to move on, passing through the eerie town with a sense of caution. Jed, curious about the quiet buildings they passed, questioned whether they should investigate. However, Clyde shook his head, opting to prioritize their mission. "No, let's just ride on, kid. We have some catching up to do," Clyde responded, his voice resolute. As they safely exited Silverton, Jed couldn't help but reflect on the unsettling encounter. "Man, that was freaky. Those guys just opened up on us, but I think we did good. Our reactions saved us, didn't they?" Jed remarked, a half-hearted smile on his face. Clyde's voice carried a reassuring tone. "We sure did, kid. We're still standing, and we're one step closer to the Bones gang. Let's keep moving," with determination etched on their faces. Clyde and Jed rode onward, leaving behind the eerie shadows of Silverton, their minds focused on the relentless pursuit of justice. As Clyde and Jed rode onward, their conversation turned somber. Clyde's voice carried a weight of caution and concern. "You know, these Bones gang members are no walkover, kid. We can only try our best." Confusion etched on Jed's face as he scratched his forehead. "What do you mean, Clyde? We've done good so far, haven't we?" Clyde sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We've made progress, that's for sure. But the crimes committed by these men, they're on a whole different level. They play by their own twisted rules." Jed listened intently, eager for Clyde's guidance as they continued their journey on horseback. Clyde's words carried a weight of experience and knowledge. "We don't know what we'll be up against, but even one of the Carter brothers alone is a force to be reckoned with. We need to bring them to justice for all the crimes they've committed." Curiosity and concern tugged at Jed's heart as he observed Clyde's change in demeanor. "What's bothering you, Clyde? You seem different." Clyde's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, but he quickly dismissed Jed's concern. "It's nothing, just the weight of our mission and memories from the past. We have to be cautious when we near the Bones gang." Time passed, and their eyes caught sight of two figures on horseback in the distance. Clyde's voice broke the silence. Could it be members of the Bones gang? Jed's gaze narrowed as he surveyed the approaching figures. "They're heading away from this direction, so it's possible. Let's follow them from a distance and see where they lead us," Jed suggested, urging their horses to quicken their pace. Clyde's instincts led them along a ridge, hidden from the view of Brian and George. The tension grew as they closed the distance. Clyde's eyes sharpened with recognition. "It's them, Brian and George. The Carter brothers. We'll wait and follow them across the border before making our move." Jed's excitement and desire for a swift resolution swirled within him. "We could just take them now, Clyde. It would save us the trouble of carrying their bodies back for the bounty. Clyde's expression darkened. It doesn't feel right to shoot them from behind. These men have no respect for rules or laws. They won't hesitate to shoot us if they sense any threat. Jed nodded in understanding, acknowledging the harsh reality they faced. Clyde's plan became clear as they concealed themselves behind a dense thicket of bushes, their eyes fixed on their targets. Both Brian and George carried the stolen loot, burdened by their ill-gotten gains. Jed couldn't help but point out, "They can't run far with all that weight." Clyde's voice carried a mixture of determination and caution. "We approach them, shout them out. As soon as they reach for their guns, we take action." Jed's eyes gleamed with determination. "This is it, Clyde! The moment we've been trailing for!" With adrenaline pumping through their veins, they galloped forward, dismounting just behind Brian and George. "Brian!" Clyde's voice sliced through the air, causing Brian to halt abruptly. George followed suit. The brothers instinctively knew that their pursuers were hot on their heels. In a synchronized motion, Brian and George spun around, guns drawn and ready for a fight. The tension hung heavy in the air. Without hesitation, George fired a shot, striking Jed in the shoulder, reopening his previous wound. Jed's anguished cry filled the air as Clyde, reacting swiftly, shot George in the head. George's lifeless body slumped from his horse, crashing to the ground. Brian, his horse in a frenzy, fired wildly in Clyde's direction but missed his mark. "Put the gun down, Brain!" Clyde's voice carried authority, his own gun steady and aimed at Brian. Frustrated, Brain threw his gun to the ground, cursing his horse's behavior. He dismounted, standing 20 feet away from Clyde, their eyes locked in a chilling standoff. Meanwhile, Jed writhed in agony nearby, clutching his wounded shoulder. "You destroyed my gang!" Brian's voice dripped with anger and vengeance. "Do you know who you're messing with?" Clyde's gaze hardened, and a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. He knew that a pivotal moment was upon them, one that would determine their fate and the destiny of the Bones gang. "Don't move! Don't take another step forward, I'm warning you." Clyde's voice was firm, his gun steady as he kept Brian in his sights. "The only reason I haven't killed you by now is because I wanted to remind you of something first." "Remind me of something? What are you, a salesman or something?" Brian replied with a hint of humor, trying to downplay the gravity of the situation. Clyde opened up the floodgates of Brian's memories, forcing him to relive the horrific past. Images of the gang torturing a farm family, setting their home ablaze, and the heinous act against Clyde's sister played before Brian's eyes. The weight of his past sins hung heavily upon him. "Kid, I was just young myself. We were just foolish young men, you know, with the liquor and all." Brian tried to justify his past actions, attempting to explain away the darkness that had consumed him. "You ain't sorry!" Clyde's voice was unwavering. "You've done more hideous crimes since then. You've never changed or tried to change. And now your time is up, Brian. The days of the Bones gang are over." Brian glanced to the side where his gun lay on the floor, just out of reach. Clyde read the intention in his eyes and warned him sternly. "Don't even think about it." Brian looked back at his gun, contemplating his options. "Ah, come on. Sure, you must want to test yourself against me? Instead of just taking me in like this, it's all too easy this way." He goaded, suggesting a duel. Clyde considered the proposition. A duel might settle this once and for all, but it was risky. "You wouldn't stand a chance, old boy," Clyde replied with a mix of confidence and caution. "Maybe not. I've heard you're a sharpshooter, so maybe it'll be easier for you to take me in dead, instead of tagging me all the way back down there alive. Isn't that going to be a bit much?" Brian laid out his reasons, pushing for the high-stakes showdown. Clyde pondered Brian's words, wrestling with his emotions and the consequences of each choice. "Yes, it would be easier to take him in dead," he thought to himself. He took a deep breath, weighing the risks. "What do you say I get my gun and put it in my holster, and no one shoots until your friend over there whistles?" Brian suggested, gesturing towards Jed. "This is your last stand, Brian, and you don't stand a chance." Fine, I'll give you the chance in a dual shootout. Slowly put the gun in your holster and get into position, Clyde declared, accepting the challenge. Brian nodded, a hint of determination flickering in his eyes. He slowly holstered his gun and took a few steps back, positioning himself a fair distance away from Clyde. Jed, recovering from his shoulder wound, watched the scene with both fear and admiration for Clyde's bravery. He held his whistle, ready to signal the start of the duel. The tension was palpable as the two men faced off, knowing that only one of them would walk away from this encounter. The dusty wind whispered through the desolate landscape, as if the land itself was holding its breath, anticipating the outcome of this final, fateful standoff. Brains slowly retrieved his gun, holstering it with a newfound sense of resignation. The tension between the two men was palpable as they stood in the middle of the dusty roadway, their gazes locked. Jed's palms were slick with sweat as he clutched the whistle tightly. "When you're ready, Jed." Clyde's voice was steady, his eyes unwavering. Jed took a deep breath, mustering his courage, and blew into the whistle. The shrill sound pierced the air, signaling the start of the duel. In an instant Brian made his move, his hand lightening fast as he drew his gun and aimed it at Clyde. The air crackled with anticipation. Clyde, cool and composed, reacted with lightning reflexes. He evaded Brian's shot, his movements precise and calculated. In a swift motion, Clyde fired 2 shots, each finding their mark with deadly accuracy. The impact sent Brian's body crashing to the ground, lifeless and motionless. Jed let out a mixture of relief and admiration. "I knew you would do it!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with awe. But as the adrenaline subsided, Jed's wounded shoulder began to throb, pain radiating through his body. "Clyde, my shoulder. It hurts." Jed grimaced, clutching his injured arm. Clyde's concern immediately shifted to his wounded companion. He dismounted his horse and hurried to Jed's side, supporting him with a strong grip. "Easy now, Jed. Let's get you patched up," Clyde said, his voice gentle yet resolute. Clyde rummaged through their saddlebags, retrieving a makeshift first aid kit. With practiced hands, he cleaned Jed's wound and applied a bandage to staunch the bleeding. The process was meticulous and focused, as Clyde's experience in surviving gunfights had taught him the importance of quick and effective medical attention. "There, that should hold you for now," Clyde said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "We'll need to find a proper doctor once we get back down south." Jed nodded, the pain in his shoulder beginning to dull. Grateful for Clyde's steady presence, he mustered a smile. "Thanks, Clyde. I don't know what I would have done without you." Clyde's response was a simple nod, his eyes filled with determination. "We're in this together, Jed. Now let's finish what we started." With Jed's wound attended to, the two men mounted their horses once again. The weight of their journey seemed heavier now as they rode. The two lifeless bodies of Brian and George slung over their horses, the bags of loot still in their possession. The somber silence enveloped them, interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of hooves against the dusty trail. As they ventured back south, the desert landscape stretched before them, a stark reminder of the harshness they had endured. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror their journey. The air was heavy with the weight of their accomplishments and losses, their thoughts consumed by the dangers that lay ahead. Clyde's gaze remained focused, his mind already planning their next move. He knew that the journey was far from over. The Bones gang may have been dealt a severe blow, but there were still loose ends to tie up and justice to be served. Jed, his wounded shoulder throbbing, looked at Clyde with a newfound admiration. They had come a long way together, facing hardships and confronting their pasts head-on. The bond between them had solidified through their shared experiences, and Jed felt a sense of purpose and determination that he had never known before. As the sun began to set, casting hues of orange and gold across the vast desert landscape, Clyde and Jed rode on, their hearts filled with a mix of weariness and resolve. The trail of the Bones gang led them ever onward, and they were determined to bring an end to the legacy of darkness that had plagued their lives. As the night drew to a close, Clyde and Jed found themselves riding towards the horizon, chasing the rising sun. The air was cool and invigorating, a refreshing contrast to the arduous journey they had endured. The horses moved with a steady rhythm, their hooves creating a symphony of sound against the earth beneath them. As the first rays of dawn broke through the darkness, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Clyde and Jed felt a surge of renewed energy. The challenges they had faced, the battles won and lost, all seemed to converge in this moment. It was a turning point, a culmination of their shared journey. The landscape unfolded before them, a tapestry of rolling hills and sprawling plains. The vastness of the frontier stretched out as far as the eye could see, an untamed wilderness waiting to be explored. There was a sense of freedom in the air, an unspoken understanding that they had chosen their own path and carved their own destiny. As they rode side by side, Clyde and Jed exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged through hardship and triumph. They had become more than partners, they were brothers, bound by a shared purpose and unwavering loyalty. The sunrise painted their faces in warm hues, casting a glow of determination and resilience. Each passing mile brought them closer to their ultimate goal, the resolution they sought for themselves and for those who had fallen victim to the Bones Gang's reign of terror. With every beat of their horses' hooves, Clyde and Jed carried the weight of their past, but they also carried a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but they were prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them. As they traveled into the sunrise, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself recognized the significance of their journey. The vast expanse of the frontier became a backdrop for their quest, an ever-changing canvas that mirrored their own transformations. In that moment, as the sun bathed the landscape in golden light, Clyde and Jed knew that their journey was not just about seeking revenge or chasing bounties. It was about finding redemption, about rewriting their own stories, and about reclaiming the light that had been dimmed by darkness. With hearts filled with determination and spirits alight with purpose, Clyde and Jed rode on. The sunrise marked not only the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. The legacy of the Bones Gang may have been shattered, but their own legacy, forged through resilience and unwavering resolve, was just beginning. As the morning sun bathed them in its warmth, Clyde and Jed embraced the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were bound by a code of justice and honor, propelled forward by the echoes of their past and the promise of a brighter future. And so, they rode into the sunrise, two figures against the vast expanse, leaving a trail of dust and determination in their wake. Their story was far from over, but with hearts united and a bond unbreakable, Clyde and Jed were ready to carve their names into the annals of history. As legends of the frontier. The end.